The Commission, Uncle Paulie, P. Diddy, Caesar Leo, De Janeiro, Charlie Baltimore, Iceberg Slim, the most shady, Frankie Baby.
Fuck.
My man Calypso and the kid Jason.
Fucking Philly Leotardo. She told me he warned her about giving us points if I take.
Phil's a pimp. It's goddamn Johnny Sack. It's his message to the other captains, that fucking animal. Take it easy. Fuck that.
Rusty, car's here.
I'm telling you, Carmine. We go all out, we'll steamroll right over John. And I predict the guys in the street in Brooklyn, Queens, they'll welcome us as fucking heroes. It'll be easy.
It's a fucking declaration of war by Johnny, if you ask me.
I really hope Uncle Paul and Gotti can put this to bed once and for all, you know?
I hope so too, Tommy.
Where are they?
Nothing yet, Angie. Don't make a move. Hold your position. You hear me? Hold your position till I tell you.
Chanel #5. Gloria loves this perfume. Says it smells like money.
You better not get him mixed up. Your wife will go crazy.
Must be stuck in traffic.
Yeah.
So what are you and Francis gonna do for the holidays?
We're gonna go to the house in Lido Beach. Merry Christmas, Frankie.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah. To you.
Sammy, they're right next to us. They're right next to us.
I heard you. If they look at us, I'm gonna start blasting, John. I swear to God, I'm gonna start shooting if they look at us. Don't shoot me, all right? It's at the light, the red light, first light. They're coming through, get ready. They're gone, John.
Come on, Tommy. There's nothing you can do here.
Castellano was gunned down on a New York street by 4 men who escaped.
What we have here are 2 cold-blooded murders.
Castellano's bodyguard, mafioso Cap.
Police think younger mob members may have decided the time had come for a change in leadership, suddenly and violently.
About that, every single channel.
Frankie says everybody got away clean. That Tommy's real broken up about his uncle, but he ain't gonna give us no problems.
Poor Tommy, guy's a sweetheart. We gotta let him know we mean him no harm.
Yeah. Now what we gotta worry about is who's gonna go up against us.
Come on, who's gonna challenge us now?
Well, you never know. You got the Chin, the Rotondo brothers. They're both in business with Paul.
Screw those bums. We ain't running scared of no one.
Well, the boss of bosses is dead.
Yeah. He lived a long life. His maid's gonna miss him.
His wife won't. Geez, the guy goes out and pays a fortune for a penile implant so he can bone the maid, and then we go and whack him. We're gonna make a great team. To the real gangsters.
Yeah.
You and me, Sammy.
My dreams filthy, my mom and pops mixed me with Jamaican rum and whiskey. What a set off, should've pushed them dead off, wiped the sweat off. Cause in this world I'm dead off, squeeze let off, then sped off. Ain't no shook hands in Brooklyn.
So Charlie's going on about another piece of work he done, right? And I gotta hit the head. But he won't stop, you know? He won't let me go. So finally, I can't take it no more. So I go, Charlie, I know how your stories end up. They all end up the same way. I killed the guy.
That's Charlie. I mean, you guys, we could socialize, but I can't socialize with those guys out there no more. You know? Can't bring myself down. You know what I mean? And of course, you're the boss now, John.
Yeah. If we can get it around without being interrupted, a couple good years, you're gonna put this thing together where they can never break it, never destroy it, even if we die. Be a good thing.
Hey, salud.
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 Bon Natal.
Santa Claus is working overtime, huh?
Jackpot's over $1 million and counting.
That's some Christmas present to you, John.
Gotta admit, the job does have its perks.
Hey, what do you say we send them feds out there something to eat, huh? They must be freezing their cojones off.
It's a hell of a way to have to spend Christmas Eve.
Screw them bums. They're there all day. You want me to feel bad for them? Screw them.
Chapter 10. I'm gonna blow this motherfucker away. Agnello Della Croce didn't notice the December 15th Times headline on the Castellano story for the simple reason he was not around to see it. Having checked in under an assumed name into Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens in late November, Della Croce died on December 2, 1985, at the age of 71. The cause was cancer. As if to foreshadow what was to come, Della Croce's obituary in the New York Times mentioned the uneasy relationship with Mr. Castellano. Della Croce, while alive, was the restraining hand who kept the Gambino family factions from tearing each other apart. The Bergen crew, led by Gotti, despised Castellano and felt threatened by him, particularly when the Ruggiero drug indictment hit. Yet it was old-timer Della Croce who told Gotti's people to hew the line, respect the boss, and not try any warlike moves. Although Della Croce stalled when Castellano asked for the Ruggiero tapes, eventually the boss's attorneys got their copies in the course of normal pre-trial discovery. What Castellano heard and saw of the tapes angered him to no end. Ruggiero had not only bad-mouthed him, but had discussed Mafia Commission meetings with the non-member. Then there was the clear evidence that heroin trafficking had been the lifeblood for the Bergen crew, done more or less openly and involving numerous family members and associates. The hate for Castellano among Gotti and his crew had been simmering for many months, and the FBI had picked up on it almost immediately, thanks to the various electronic bugging devices it had planted around town. One was inside the Casa Storta in Brooklyn, where on January 26, 1983, a table bug picked up Ruggiero meeting with the acting boss of the Colombo family, Gennaro Jerry Lang Langella, and a capo Dominic Montemorano. It became clear in a dispute over a $50,000 construction industry payoff that Castellano had denied the Colombo group. Ruggiero blurted out, "I think Paul's looking to whack Neil," referring to Della Croce. Ruggiero said he even told Della Croce, "Why don't you just do it and forget about it? Go in and fucking smoke him." "What did I tell Say Donnie?" piped up Langella to Montemorano. "After the holidays, what would happen? That Neil and Johnny Gotti will die." Ruggiero commiserated that the situation within the family and Castellano's avarice was dragging things down. "He ain't gonna get away with it no more," Langella said. "I tell you, Ange, somebody's gonna—" "I know," replied Ruggiero. "Believe me, Jerry, I know." Robert DiBernardo was one of those gangsters who had clout in the Gambino family not because he was a killer, but because he brought in money. Initially considered a member of the DeCavalcante crime family in New Jersey, DiBernardo was an earner, and did so through his holdings in the pornography industry, particularly around Times Square peep shows. When needed, DiBernardo traveled to California to do deals with porn merchants there. He brought in money, lots of it, and as a result wasn't expected to do work, commit murders. His home in Hewlett Harbor on Long Island was not far from Ruggiero's in Cedarhurst. It was late in September 1985 that DiBernardo, after talking with Ruggiero, conveyed a message to Sammy Gravano. For years, Gravano had been a mainstay of the Gambino family's construction rackets, and so aligned with Castellano. Everyone knew that. What wasn't so clear was his allegiance to the boss. DiBernardo's message to Gravano was a request, nicely put, asking if he could visit Ruggiero and John Gotti in their home turf of Queens. As Gravano remembered things, he went. There was no good reason not to go. But as it turned out, only Ruggiero showed up. Both men talked. Ruggiero was the one to broach a very sensitive subject, one that could earn him his own death if it ever leaked to the wrong people. "Sammy, we're going to make a move," said Ruggiero, according to Gravano. "I'm making a move on Paul. Are you with me? I'm going to blow this motherfucker away." Gravano would later recall that he sat quietly, letting Ruggiero speak and make his pitch. Since Gravano would later cooperate with the FBI, his rendition of events in this crucial period in the Gambino family is the best and only version of what happened, since the other key participants are mostly dead or just never talked. As Gravano remembered things, Ruggiero told him Gotti was with him on the murder plot and that the conspirators were going to try and pull in another key captain, Frank DeChico. "Angie, I'm not going to tell you my position is," Gravano told writer Peter Moss, "but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm getting in my car and going to see Frank and myself and tell him about this meeting we're having now. You got any problem with that?" Ruggiero said it was okay for Gravano to reach out to DeChico, telling Gravano that he needed both of them as part of the plot, or as he put it, "I'm dead without you." At DeChico's house, both Gravano and he took a walk to toss around the idea of killing Castellano. It was something, Moss later wrote, that was almost unheard of since Vito Genovese tried to kill Frank Costello in 1957. Hits of a mafia boss just didn't happen without the sanction of the other families. During the walk, Gravano and DeChico talked about the pros and cons of killing Castellano. One option, said Gravano, was to just sit things out and let the Gotti faction fight it out with the Castellano group. But in the end, both men agreed that they would be part of it, assuming the Gotti group had its act together. "Neil's not long for this world," DeChico said, according to Gravano, referring to the underboss's terminal illness. "Paul may go up on these cases he has." Castellano's succession plan included having Thomas Gambino as boss and Tommy Bellotti as underboss. The prospect of those men in leadership appalled Gravano and DeChico. While an intelligent garment center trucking businessman, Gambino was derisively considered nothing but a dressmaker, and Bellotti an abusive mob hothead. The better option, it seemed, was to remove Castellano by force and have Gotti take over, with DeChico in the wing if Gotti screwed up and had to be killed. The next day, according to Gravano, he and DeChico summoned Ruggiero to come to Brooklyn, where they told him, "We are with you." But they demanded that Gotti come down to the next series of meetings. They didn't want the Bergen crew leader to act like a prima donna, and told Ruggiero that if Gotti didn't show, their offer to be part of the murder plot would be withdrawn. Anxious not to lose key allies, Gotti showed up at the follow-up meeting with Gravano, DeChico, Ruggiero, and DiBernardo, who was really there to be a messenger. The discussion then centered on making alliances with the older mobsters in the family, the respected people like Joe M. Gallo, the consigliere, and Joe Piney Armon, a captain who held sway with the Restaurant Workers' Union. Both men were Castellano allies, so the plotters had to be careful in approaching them. Known as Shorty, he was 5 feet 5 inches tall and 140 pounds. Armon was a drug trafficker himself, with the federal record for narcotics, so in one sense he had a common interest with Ruggiero. His older brother Stephen also had a narcotics conviction. He had no known job or occupation, and aside from Little Italy, Armon hung out in the area of East 14th Street in Manhattan, and over the years had become very respected in the family. His backing of the plotters was seen as crucial to winning over the seasoned gangsters in the Borgata. Gotti had indicated that Armon would back the plan. Gravano needed proof. In trying to keep the planning clandestine, Gravano said he, the Chico, Gotti, and Ruggiero arranged a meeting with Armon in the basement of the Staten Island home of Joe Watts. Long a fixture in the Gambino family, Watts was known as the German, but couldn't become a member of the mob because his father was believed to be Welsh. He sometimes used the alias Joe Russo. How he got to be called the German is unclear, but it didn't matter, because he had earned a great deal of respect in the underworld. Watts seemed to earn his respect because he had no qualms about violence. According to court papers filed years later in federal court, Watts allegedly had connections to numerous Gambino family homicides over the years, going back to the late 1970s. It was then, according to prosecutors, that Watts lured one Anthony Miano, suspected of taking part in the kidnapping and death of a nephew of Carlo Gambino, to the Watts home on Staten Island under the ruse that he had some tires to give the victim. When Miano arrived and drove his truck into the driveway, Watts shot and killed him, according to prosecutors. Watts was never charged with the homicide. Other murders laid at the feet of Watts took place in the early 1980s. In one case, that of the slaying of Nicolina and Michael Izak for the killing of Gambino soldier Robert Russo. Castellano personally gave Watts the assignment for the homicides, prosecutors alleged. It was in early March 1982 that Watts and other Gambino family associates tortured and killed the couple in a Staten Island social club, said prosecutors, adding that the bodies were never found. In 1984, John Sinamo was found hanging from a tree in Queens, and while it seemed like a case of suicide, investigators later alleged that Watts, Ruggiero, and Willie Boy Johnson carried out the murder on the orders of John Gotti. Watts was also never charged with those killings. So Watts was a man the Bergen crew had trusted, and his home seemed a proper place to meet in secret with Armon. For added security, the plotters asked Watts, who was still just an associate, to leave the house for a while. As Gravano remembered things, he and DeChico in particular wanted to hear from Armon himself how he supported the plot. At one point, Gotti started to answer for Armon, but DeChico cut him short and said, "Please, John, let me do the talking now," remembered Gravano. Armon told the group that consigliere Joe Engala wasn't on board with the plot, but wouldn't do anything to oppose it. He would stay on the sidelines. DeChico questioned Armon about whether Gala would tip off Castellano to the conspiracy, and the aging capo answered with ice in his veins. "If he betrays us or backs up 1 inch, I will kill him," recalled Gravano. The great irony in Armon's position was that he was plotting the death of his boss, a man he once waxed philosophically with about the way mob life could be so rewarding if one survived, words all caught by the FBI bug in Castellano's house. "This life of ours, this is a wonderful life," Castellano said to Armon. "If you can get through this life like this and get away with it, hey, that's great. But it's very, very unpredictable. There are so many ways you can screw it up." "Yeah, Paul, you're right," replied Armon. "Because there's just so many fucking things that can blow up on you," Castellano continued. "Yeah, Paul, there are," Armon agreed. "There's so many fucking ways they can get to you," said Castellano, probably referring to the FBI. Chapter 11. Fucking John's Crazy. In the years before Castellano, Gotti, and Gravano were even born, life among the Italian organized crime figures was sketchy in terms of longevity. In the very early part of the 20th century in New York City, cops were perplexed by the barrel murders. Italian criminals didn't have highly organized groups at the time, but they were noticed by cops because of the way they killed their victims with multiple stab wounds and then stuffed them in wine barrels. Even if you had clout on the street, an Italian criminal was an easy target for assassination by rivals, no questions asked. During the early days of Prohibition, bootleggers, who were largely Italians, warred with each other over territory, and bodies littered the landscape. No matter how important a criminal might be in the Italian gang landscape, he could be fair game. Death among the Italians seemed always around the corner for those who weren't vigilant. Frankie Yale, a powerful mobster in Brooklyn who controlled numerous rackets, was machine-gunned to death in July 1928 as he frantically tried to drive away from his pursuers. His death was attributed to Al Capone's anger over a stolen load of booze. Michael Abadamarco took over for Yale and was himself slain as he sat in the car just 3 months later. But in 1931, after the Castelmarisi War in New York led to the killing of old boss Joseph Mazzaria and then later Salvatore Maranzano, those who helped engineer their assassinations set up a structure for the American Mafia keystoned by the formation of the ruling commission. The chief architect was Charles Lucky Luciano, who, for a variety of reasons, believed everyone should cooperate in some kind of structured setting as a way of avoiding unnecessary bloodshed and making sure the spoils of crime were protected. Among the various duties of the commission was to decide policy for the Mafia families, in this case 5 families in New York City, and where necessary, decree the fate of a boss who may have made some transgression. No longer could family bosses be summarily executed without any okay from the powers of La Cosa Nostra. That rule also applied to the settling of other disputes. The commission was set in place to try and defuse potentially explosive situations by conclaves known as sit-downs, which meant exactly that. Emissaries of the 5 families got together to talk over problems and make a decision about who was owed what. The commission's existence didn't mean that bosses couldn't be killed. In fact, in 1951, Vincent Mangiano, the boss of what was to become the Gambino family later, disappeared, and it was widely believed that Doc Lantoff, Albert Anastasia, was behind the disappearance. The members of the commission called Anastasia on the carpet, and he explained that it was Mangiano who had been plotting against him, hence the need for a preemptive strike. But in October 1957, Anastasia, who was not well liked by other mob bosses, was himself gunned down as he sat in a barber's chair in the Park Sheraton Hotel. The lesson in all this was that if you wanted to take out a boss, you needed the approval, or at least the acquiescence, of the other commission members. Gotti, Gravano, and the rest of the plotters against Castellano knew that they had to sound out the heads of the other mafia families. If they couldn't call a meeting of the commission to raise the question, they certainly could go through the back doors and get a sense of how the other bosses felt about Castellano. For a start, Gotti was very tight with Joseph Messino, his neighbor and Howard Beach, and a powerful captain in the Bonanno crime family, who was the effective street boss of the clan with the incarceration of official boss Philip Rastelli. Gotti bragged that he had Messino in his pocket and counted on the Bonanno family's support. The way Gravano explained it, since the Bonanno family had been on probation with the commission because of drug dealing and its penetration by undercover FBI agent Joseph Pistone, the removal of Castellano increased the family's chances of getting back in the good graces with the rest of the 5 families. In terms of the tumultuous Colombo crime family, its bosses had expressed disdain about Castellano earlier to Ruggiero. Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo hated Castellano's greed. Another important member of the Lucchese family, Anthony Gaspipe Caso, was somebody Gravano said he approached for support. How would Gaspipe feel if Castellano was no longer boss? Caso was asked according to Gravano. The reply, again according to Gravano, he didn't give a fuck about Paul. So the Lucchese support was viewed as in the bag. At least that was the story from Gravano. But in a biography of Caso, Gaspipe, Confessions of a Mafia Boss, published in 2008 in collaboration with the late writer Philip Carlo, the Lucchese mobster had an entirely different recollection. It was the Chico, Caso said, who approached him about the Castellano plot, not Gravano. Once hearing about the idea of killing the boss, Caso told Carlo his reaction was one of shock and surprise. He told the Chico as much. "Fucking John's crazy," Caso told the Chico as they walked near Diker Park in Brooklyn. "This gonna do nothing but make trouble for everybody. The Chin, Gigante, and Vic Amuso won't sit down for this. We're gonna have to, all of us, come after John. Not only John, but everybody involved in this." Caso said he counseled the Chico, who he considered a friend, to be careful. He predicted if Gotti did pull off the hit, he and everyone involved would be dead within a year. The Chico, according to Caso's recollection, was to say nothing in reply. As Caso had indicated, the powerful Genovese crime family was against the idea. The ties between Castellano and Genovese boss Vincent the Chin Gigante were too strong, recalled Gravano. There was no way that the Genovese family could be approached for its backing of the plot. In the end, the Genovese family was kept outside the loop. The plotters figured that since they were breaking the rules of La Cosa Nostra by killing a boss, they could expect the Genovese family and perhaps some others to seek retaliation. A war was possible. Yet, Gravano said, if it comes down to it, we'll go to war with them. On December 2, 1985, Agnella della Croce finally died. Whenever somebody of that stature passed away in the Mafia, it was considered a sign of respect that members and associates show up for the wake or funeral. Paul Castellano did neither. The no-show by the Gambino boss at the wake was particularly galling to the rest of the family. Castellano would claim he had to stay away to avoid the publicity and out of concern for his legal cases, but it was seen as the ultimate disrespect. Della Croce's casket was taken after the funeral to St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. There, in a niche within the cloister mausoleum, the old underboss was put to final rest. The peaceful setting was amidst tasteful wood-paneled walls. Even today, the location is memorable for any who visit. Ecclesiastical music at a very low volume can just be heard in the background, lending to a contemplative atmosphere. Della Croce is doing his eternal rest just yards away from another noteworthy niche holding the body of Frankie Gotti, the son of Gotti who died at the age of 12 in an accident on the streets of Howard Beach. With Della Croce, their main buffer between them and Castellano gone, Gotti and the Bergen crew knew they had to move swiftly. For security, the plotters divided their operation. Gravano and De Chico stayed in a basement suite in Joe Watt's home on Staten Island. Ruggiero and Gotti made their own arrangements. In this era, before cell phones, the group stayed in contact by using certain landline telephones and relaying cryptic messages, Gravano remembered. The difficult part of the plotting turned out to be how to actually carry out the hit on Castellano. With so much surveillance surrounding him, it would be foolhardy for any attempt to be made on Castellano at his home, or as he was leaving it. Again, Gravano related to Mas that a couple of schemes were considered. Watts's family would vacate the house while plastic sheeting was put up, ostensibly for new paint, but in actuality to catch the blood and guts when Bilotti walked into an ambush he would be lured to. With Bilotti out of the way, the Chico would call Castellano and say Bilotti was ill, and that he would be his driver. Pick him up at his house and then kill him, said Gravano. We kicked that around, Gravano told Moss. What if Paul don't want to come out? What if this, what if that? It was too haphazard. Another plan, according to Gravano, was to follow Castellano and Bilotti as they drive to a diner in Brooklyn they liked for breakfast. Once they settled in for coffee and eggs, an old friend of Gravano's known as Joseph Oldman Peruta would walk unnoticed into the diner, don a ski mask in the bathroom, and then come out and shoot both men to death. Peruta was an elderly man who had nerves to handle the shooting. Maybe it could work. Yet it had big risks, namely, that in a busy diner things could suddenly go awry. Then there was always the possibility that police would be nearby, perhaps themselves on a coffee break. But suddenly, Castellano unwittingly presented the plotters with an unexpected opportunity. Castellano asked some of his key captains, Thomas Gambino, Jimmy Fiala, Dan Marino, and De Chico himself, to have dinner at Sparks Restaurant on East 46th Street in Manhattan. Gravano said De Chico didn't know what the meeting was for, but he told the plotters the date and time, December 16th, at 5 p.m. Chapter 12. He's Gone. A good murder, one you can pull off without getting arrested on the spot, takes planning. The plotters knew a place and time where Castellano could be found, but to ambush him in Midtown Manhattan, at the height of the Christmas shopping and party season, not to mention rush hour, presented challenges. But as Gravano remembered, it also was a great opportunity. There would be thousands of people on the street going about their business. The hit would only take a few seconds, and the confusion would be in our favor, Gravano told Mas. Nobody would be expecting anything like this, least of all Paul, and being able to disappear afterwards in the crowds would be in our favor. So we decided this is when and where it is going to happen. The assassination team would have the element of surprise, but it still needed to be an organized group, one with backup shooters in case something went wrong. The escape route had to be prearranged, nothing helter-skelter. Then the disguises had to be picked to limit to the greatest extent possible that any of the shooters would be identified. A key planning session took place a day or two before December 16 in the basement of Gravano's office building on Stillwell Avenue in Brooklyn. Gravano remembered 11 people showing up. Gotti and Ruggiero was one group of arrivals, while Frank DeCicco and Joe Watts came together. The curious thing about the planning was that Gotti only let a handful of people, Gravano, DeCicco, Ruggiero, and Watts, know what was going on and who the target was. The others were in the dark, told only that 2 people were going to die and that the hit was huge. John tells them that no matter what, don't run, even if there are cops around, Gravano recalled. These 2 guys have to go. Don't worry about the cops, he says, because if you run and these guys ain't dead, we will kill you. It was clear that it was a do-or-die situation. The afternoon of December 16, the plotters met at what investigator Bruce Mao said was Madison Square Park, a square patch of greenery by 23rd Street and Madison Avenue, within the shadow of the iconic Flatiron Building. As Gravano would later tell the FBI, the designated shooters were John Carneglia, Anthony Rampino, Vinny Artuso, Sal Scala, and Ed Lino, the drug dealer who finally had become a made man. Gravano, who was driven to the park by Joe Watts, saw the gunmen were also dressed alike, in long beige overcoats and fur, Muscovite style. The garb, which had been acquired by Ruggiero, was a nice way of assuring confusion among eyewitnesses, Gravano thought. Gotti then told the group what everyone needed to know. The targets were to be Castellano and Bellotti. Castellano's last day of his life started with his leaving the White House on Toad Hill with Bellotti as the usual driver of the black Lincoln Town Car. He lunched at a diner on Staten Island with Jimmy Fila and New Jersey mob boss John Riggi. Finished at the diner by around 2 p.m., Castellano and Bellotti drove over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge to Brooklyn, where they went north on Route 278 to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. The bridge route to Manhattan was generally too slow and unpredictable with traffic. Once in Manhattan, they went north to Madison Avenue, where Castellano's attorney Jimmy LaRosa had an office. The location, ironically, was just a few blocks north of Madison Square Park, where Gotti was meeting with the hit team. They reached the office around 2:30 p.m., and since it was Christmas time, Castellano delivered envelopes with cash to LaRosa's administrative and secretarial staff, who had been working in the back office on the stolen car trial. Castellano and LaRosa chatted. The trial seemed of late to be going well, so they both had a positive vibe. Having finished at LaRosa's, Castellano had some time before the meeting at Sparks' restaurant and did a little bit of shopping for perfume for his secretary. The 2 men illegally parked and got a ticket, which they took with them and didn't discard. Then it was back in the car for the trip uptown and dinner. After the final meeting in the park with the hit team, Gotti and Gravano separated and proceeded to 46th Street. The shooters arrived separately and took up prearranged posts around the restaurant entrance, trying to look inconspicuous. As Bruce Mao later remembered, Gravano said the shooters had definite assignments. Lino and Scala, who were brothers-in-law, were to target Bellotti. John Caneglia and Artuso were to deal with Castellano, while Rampino was on the scene as a backup. Various reports later had Ruggiero and Watts in the area as well. Traffic and parking being what it was in Manhattan, Gotti and Gravano didn't have any easy time of it getting in a position. The plan was for both men to sit in their car on East 46th Street, just to the west side of 3rd Avenue. The spot was about 200 feet from the front of Sparks and would, if traffic cooperated, afford them an unobstructed view of the scene. However, their first pass to the parking spot didn't work out, so they had to go around the block and try again. The second time they were successful, and they didn't have to wait long for the show to begin. Gotti and Gravano had hardly settled into the parking spot when Sammy glanced to his right and got the surprise of his life. There, perhaps 3 feet away, was Castellano's Lincoln, with Bellotti in the driver's seat of the car, which was stopped for a traffic light with the interior dome light on. Gravano, trying to avoid eye contact with Bellotti, told Gotti and then got on the walkie-talkie to tell the shooters that their quarry was about to arrive. Still, Gravano said he was worried that Bellotti and Castellano might notice him and Gotti and think something was up, and suddenly abandon their plan to go to Sparks. Gravano said he put his hand on his gun, thinking that he might have to waste Castellano and Bellotti on the spot. Gotti told him to be cool and let the hit team do its job. The light changed, and Castellano's Lincoln proceeded with the crosstown traffic east to go the short distance to Sparks. DeCicco was in the restaurant, as was Fila and Tom Scambino. They were waiting for Castellano, who at this point was a bit late. The tardiness also was apparent to one of the shooters, later identified as Artuso, who, a bystander overheard grumbling, "They should have been here by now." It was about 5:30 p.m. when Castellano and Bellotti pulled up in front of Sparks, the limousine maneuvering to the right to get close to the curb. Across 3rd Avenue, Gotti and Gravano saw the shooters spring into action. Corneglia, as one bystander would later testify, along with Artuso, approached Castellano as he opened the passenger-side front door. Corneglia fired, but Artuso's gun, it was later reported, jammed and didn't shoot, although some pundits believed he simply lost his nerve. Hit 6 times in the head and body, Castellano crumpled to the pavement, his head by the vehicle and his mouth agape and eyes wide open. In his death spasm, he clutched a pair of leather gloves in his right hand. Bellotti had exited the driver's side door, apparently to assist Castellano go into the restaurant, but never got any further. Scala and his brother-in-law Lino fired at Bellotti, also hitting him a total of 6 times. But that wasn't all for the Whig. A witness, Jeffrey Davidson, would later tell the FBI and repeat in court that after the first round of shots, he saw a man he identified as Corneglia walk around the front of Castellano's limousine to Bellotti as he lay in the middle of 46th Street and then fire 3 times at him. Bruce Mao noted that Corneglia was heard cursing at Bellotti as he shot him. It was over that quickly. The biggest mob hit in decades went down almost as planned, with Castellano and Bellotti both dead. The shooting set off pandemonium among the crowd of pedestrians on the street. A nurse attempted to give aid to Bellotti in the street, but he was long gone. Inside Sparks, a waiter approached to Chico and Fila and told him Castellano wouldn't be making it for dinner. Gravano later recalled that Chico, the 5th columnist who had betrayed Castellano to the plotters, told Fila the boss was dead, and that on hearing the news Fila turned ashen, since he could have been in the car with Castellano, but opted instead to travel on his own to Sparks. "Don't worry, you wouldn't have been hurt," Chico said. Both men ran into Thomas Gambino coming into the restaurant. He must have arrived seconds before the shooting and told him his uncle was dead and to leave quickly, which he did. The shooters left at a brisk walking pace, not running, proceeding east along 46th Street. Gravano and Gotti, meanwhile, had seen the shooting and when it was over drove slowly past the carnage. Gravano glanced out at Bellotti's body lying in the street in a growing pool of blood and said to Gotti, "He's gone." They both then drove east towards 2nd Avenue to make the right turn for the trip back to Brooklyn. As fate would have it, many in the law enforcement community were attending a lecture at New York University by Robert Blakey, who was the creator of the federal racketeering statute. As Blakey held court, beepers of the officials in attendance went off, almost in unison, a beeping and chirping call to action. Those alerted called their offices and heard the news, leaving the lecture for a long night on the street. Police arrived within 2 or 3 minutes to the homicide scene, but by then Gotti, Gravano, the shooters, and the rest of the hit team were long gone. Police seemed blindsided by the murders. NYPD Chief of Detectives Philip Nicastro told reporters that he didn't want to speculate as to why Castellano was killed. The department's chief spokeswoman, Alice T. McGillian, did note that it appeared that the gunmen used .380 and .32 caliber handguns. She added that the killers, there may have been 2 or 3, fled in a dark-colored car parked at 46th Street and 2nd Avenue. As for Castellano, he reportedly had about $3,000 cash in his pocket. Bellotti about $6,700. Neither man had any weapons on them or in the car. "We know there were many people on the street," McGillian said, "and we hope that someone will come forward with a better description than the ones we have." In the post-September 11 era, with the city ringed with thousands of interconnected surveillance cameras and with cops able to use license plate readers, the fleeing killers would have very likely been spotted on video and their cars tracked to wherever they were going. Assuming the cars all converged at Gravano's place in Brooklyn, the license plates would have been tracked to Stillwell Avenue and the car owners immediately identified. The case could have been broken quickly and arrests made. But this was 1985, and the cops and FBI didn't have the benefit of future technology. But what they did have, particularly with the C-16 squad led by Mao, were a small group of informants who had a good idea of who was behind the murders. So, while much of the public and the NYPD was in the dark about who killed Castellano and Bellotti, the FBI was figuring it out pretty quickly. There were at least 3, possibly 4 informants feeding Mao and his staff information over the years about Gotti and his Bergen crew. One man decided to secretly work for the FBI after he got so far into debt with the Gambino family, about $30,000, that he figured the federal government was his only way out. There was also Willie Boy Johnson, who had been a good source for years. One of the informants, later identified with the pseudonym Frankie, met on December 17 with Andres Currens by a McDonald's restaurant by Myrtle Avenue in Brooklyn. Frankie related that everyone in the Gambino family with whom he was an associate was being quiet, but he did say the word was that John Gotti had orchestrated the Castellano hit and that he was going to become the new boss. Mao and the others in the squad were skeptical about Gotti being behind things, but there had been plenty of indication that such a move made sense. Gotti knew that Castellano was prepared to split up his Bergen crew, bust Gotti down, and put him under the command of another captain. Killing a boss was a move that under normal conditions, and the rules of La Cosa Nostra, might get someone killed, but in the case of Castellano, he wasn't a boss who engendered much sympathy. The negatives for Castellano were significant. He was greedy, not only in the way he treated his own men, but also in his interaction with the bosses of the other crime families, stiffing them out of what they believed was their cut of construction and other payoffs. Castellano had a legitimate meat business, while some of the other bosses weren't so well positioned financially. There were also rumblings that Castellano was going to become an informant, as a way of getting himself out of all his legal jams. Then there was his affair with his maid, Gloria. Castellano had been carrying on with her in his own home, flaunting the relationship in front of his wife, whom many in the mob had liked. Meanwhile, Gloria had on occasion acted disrespectful to some of the mobsters when they visited Castellano, something which intensified their dislike. Gravano said in the early planning of the murder plot that he even entertained killing her in any attempt to rush Castellano at his mansion, an idea that was abandoned. So for Mao and the FBI squad, while there was the possibility of a war following Castellano's murder, it appeared that Gotti might just have been able to muster the support to pull off the coup, as the informants indicated he did. Armed with the informant leads, the FBI believed within a day or two that the Castellano homicide had been solved. The question was how they might be able to make a case that would stand up in court, and the answer for that would be a long time coming. Meanwhile, Gotti and his crew moved quickly to consolidate their position, setting up meetings of the entire leadership and the captains of the crime family. But if there was any doubt to the police or anyone in the FBI that Gotti was now ascendant, it was quickly dispelled with the way the Gambino family Christmas Eve party shaped up at Della Croce's old Ravenite Club on Mulberry. Gotti was going to eventually shift his focus from the Bergen to the Ravenite, and at the party surveillance teams noticed as Gotti seemed to be the man of the hour, getting kissed by the mobsters who lined up to shake his hand. Back in Staten Island, the only ceremony the Castellano family was worried about was the funeral for the dead boss. His family made quick work of Gloria Olarte, handing her a reported $18,000 and telling her to get out. The next matter for Castellano's family was his funeral, and things wouldn't go as easily as they did with kissing off his mistress Gloria. Because of Castellano's notoriety, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese declined to allow him to have a public mass of Christian burial. John Cardinal O'Connor believed that after much prayer. When asked why no mass for Castellano, O'Connor told reporters that under normal circumstances a Catholic would be brought into church for the funeral service. I felt we could not do that in this set of circumstances. Instances of the church barring masses for gangsters had happened before in mob history. Albert Anastasio was given only a graveside service at the non-sectarian Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn in 1957, where his brother Salvatore, a priest, blessed the open grave. But the refusal was particularly galling for Castellano's wife and his daughter Connie, as well as his sons. Nevertheless, the church did allow the Castellano family to hold a private memorial mass, without his body present, at the Blessed Sacrament Roman Catholic Church on Staten Island. To keep his burial location a secret, Castellano was entombed in Moravian Cemetery, not far from his home on Toad Hill, in an unmarked grave. A priest was present for the committal service. Bellotti was also buried at Moravian in a spot marked by a modest flat marker. About 2 days after the slaying of Castellano and Bellotti, the captains of the family and consigliere, Joe and Gallo, met at Caesar's East, a restaurant at 58th Street and 3rd Avenue. Gravano later said the place was picked because he and Adelino owned a piece of it. Gallo presided over the meeting, sitting at the head of a long table, around which the captains gathered. Gotti and DeCicco flanked Gallo, the old-timer, as he spoke. Since he was the highest-ranking member of the family, with both the boss and underboss dead, Gallo was technically in charge of things. But he spoke as though he had a gun to his back, telling the group that they didn't know who killed Castellano, but that an investigation was underway to find out what happened. In the meantime, said Gallo, Gotti and DeCicco would help him run things. The Caesars East meeting was just for show, an effort to calm the waters and tell those in the Borgata that nothing was going to happen to them, and that no war was going to break out. Gallo, based on the earlier approach the plotters made to him, already had a very good idea who killed the boss. But now they had to move forward and not risk more bloodshed. About 2 weeks after the meeting, reportedly on January 15, 1986, all of the captains again got together in the recreation room of an apartment building complex in Lower Manhattan. Gotti chaired the meeting to say the time had come, with Castellano dead, to vote for a new boss. Frankie gets up and votes for John Gotti, Gravano recalled to the meeting. It zips right around the room. Nobody opposes. It's unanimous. Gotti appointed DeCicco as his underboss and kept Gallo as the aging consigliere. He made his brother Pete a captain. Sonny Ciccone was put in charge of the dock workers, replacing Anthony Scotto, who Gravano said Gotti didn't like, possibly because of the way he hung out with celebrities and kept publicly denying his reputed ties to the mob. So it was done. A chain of events which got underway with the plane crash off Georgia in 1982 led to John Gotti, the kid from Brooklyn, who struggled to find shoes to wear as a kid, rising to become the boss of a crime family, one of the most powerful in the American mafia. Gotti did it with the help of his friends, and never had to fire a shot himself. Chapter 13. Shame on Them. While much of the world had no clue about who was responsible for Castellano's murder and had taken over control of the Gambino family, a good number of people in law enforcement figured it out right away. Gotti's name was circulated among the FBI organized crime units and their liaisons with other police agencies. The FBI informants had pretty good information, and by early January 1986, word began to leak out into the public. On January 12th, a full 3 days before the meeting of the Gambino captains in Lower Manhattan, the New York Times ran a page-one story headlined, "Ex-convict said to take control of Gambino crime organization." The first words were the name John Gotti. The word was passed along the street this week that Gotti is at the top, an official told the newspaper. It was a calm transition. Details of the way Gotti and the others planned and carried out the murder were not known at that point. The report illuminated the very telling Christmas Eve surveillance at the Ravenite Club on Mulberry Street, in which Gotti acted like the king of the block, the center of attention of all the mob big shots who showed up. DeCicco was also noted to be the underboss. The Gambino family at that point was pegged at having 20 captains, about 250 maid soldiers, and 1,000 associates. The illicit income, by conservative estimates, was over $100 million a year. Though he was baptized in Castellano and Bellatti's blood, Gotti relished the calm which followed. With the death of Castellano, mafia stories were all over the newspapers, and 1986 was turning out to be the year of the mob. But not all of the news was good. In fact, the New York mafia families had much more to contend with than just Gotti's rise to power. In the Gambino stolen car case, although the trial judge fretted about the impact of the crime boss's assassination on the jury, in the end he declined to declare a mistrial. The case would go on, even without Castellano's very obvious absence. Then there was another trial in the same courthouse involving the Colombo family, whose boss, Ralph Scopo, was charged with shaking down construction companies. On top of those cases, the massive Pizza Connection trial, involving Sicilian and American gangsters who trafficked in heroin, was grinding on, and would do so for at least another several months. Gotti himself had 2 legal battles looming. One of them was the racketeering case in Brooklyn, where he had been indicted with the now-dead Della Croce, Ruggiero, and others on charges they ran a corrupt mob enterprise. That particular federal case was different than the heroin drug indictment Ruggiero, Carneglia, and Gene Gotti faced, but it still was a big problem for Gotti. If convicted in that case, Gotti's newly minted role could come to an abrupt end. Not long after he became boss, Gotti got involved in a battery case involving a refrigerator mechanic named Romuald Pietzik, who was allegedly assaulted by Gotti and a cohort during a petty street brawl in Queens, sparked by a traffic dispute. So early 1986 was a time when Gotti had a short, peaceful interregnum as boss. He held court at the Ravenite and the money was still coming in. Yet there was an undercurrent of violence. With Castellano's death, there were some in the crime family who saw it as an opportunity to settle scores. One of those was DeChico, the underboss. The bad blood between DeChico and Gus Sclafani stemmed from the latter's accusation made to Castellano that Frankie was an informant. It was never clear what the basis for that was, but DeChico stood his ground and cleared his name with Castellano. But the damage had been done, and DeChico needed his revenge. It was March 10, 1986, and John Gotti had finally permitted the killing of Sclafani. As federal prosecutors would later allege, Gotti farmed out the hit to Watts. Homicide, as investigators would later allege in court filings, was not something unfamiliar to Watts. He had already played a role as a backup shooter in the Castellano murder a few months earlier. In 1984, when a mob associate named John Sonamo was found hanging from a tree in St. Albans, Queens, investigators believed that Watts, Angelo Ruggiero, and Willie Boy Johnson had killed him on Gotti's orders. It seems as though Sonamo was trying to convince police to investigate a murder which the Gambino family had been involved in. So, with Gotti's approval, Watts and others stabbed and shot Sclafani in the basement of the Ravenite Social Club. His body was never found. As boss, Gotti was a busy man. He had to meet emissaries from out-of-town crime families. He traveled more into Manhattan, not only for pleasure, but to meet other wise guys. The meetings all came with Gotti's new territory. But Gotti also needed to show face and be in touch with his Borgata and its various social clubs. The Bergen was still a place Gotti could get a daily shave and a haircut before his nightclub jaunts in Manhattan. The Ravenite was his new base, sort of a homage to Della Croce, and he required weekly appearances by his captains. Around the other boroughs, senior Gambino captains had their own clubs, and Gotti's appearance was a big deal. The Veterans and Friends Social Club on 86th Street in Bensonhurst was the base of Jimmy Fila, the Gambino family's respected captain, who was a power in the trash-hauling industry. Many of the Brooklyn wing of the family knew to hit the Veterans and Friends to see Fila or to find others. Fila had been close with Castellano, but after the assassination swore his allegiance to Gotti. On April 13th, almost 4 months after Gotti had been anointed boss, he planned on visiting Fila's club, one stop in his long-running papal tour of social clubs and other locales. As a result, the crowd at the club that particular Sunday was larger than normal. DeChico was there to meet with Gotti and then drive him for later appointments. The club was a nicely appointed mob joint. It had a well-stocked bar and tables, as well as the ubiquitous espresso machine. There was also a back room for more private conversations. Bensonhurst had been a mob area for decades. Just down the street was another mob spot, the 19th Hole, a social club, where powerful Lucchese crime family captain Anthony Casso hung his hat. Just a few doors from the Veterans and Friends was Tommaso's, the restaurant which had been bugged by the FBI. But while there was anticipation that Gotti would be showing up at Fila's club that Sunday, there was a sudden change of plans. He wasn't going to show up because he had to stay in Manhattan. As a result, Frank DeChico would have to cut his afternoon short and drive into Manhattan to pick up the boss. It was just after 1:30 p.m. that DeChico walked out of the club towards a four-door 1985 Buick Electra, parked opposite the front door on the other side of 86th Street. Frankie Hart Bellino accompanied DeChico to the car. DeChico never got to enter the vehicle. As he and Bellino stood near the car door on the sidewalk, a remote-controlled bomb went off. The bomb, which had been under the Buick, killed DeChico instantly and dug a 2-foot-wide crater in the street. Bellino was seriously hurt but would survive. A lady walking nearby was slightly injured. Gravano had been in the club, and when the explosion occurred, he didn't think a car had exploded, but rather something more catastrophic, like a boiler or building collapse. I came out of the club and Frankie's car is in fucking flames, remembered Gravano, and there is Frankie Hart's with blood shooting out of his feet. Gravano ran across the street to the bombed-out car and tried to help DeChico, but he was very likely dead at this point, since the bomb had done catastrophic damage, leaving a gory scene of carnage. I tried to pull him away. I grabbed a leg, but he ain't coming with it, Gravano recalled. A leg is off. One of his arms is off. I got my hand under him, and my hand went right through his body to his stomach. There's no ass. His ass, his balls, everything is completely blown off. A police van pulled up to the scene, and Gravano and others picked up what was left of DeChico and put him inside. They then did the same with Bellino, and the vehicle sped off to a nearby hospital. As Gravano told Moss, He ordered that Gotti be contacted immediately and told what happened. Then everybody else was to meet at Gravano's nearby club in Brooklyn, a place called Tally's. The police couldn't immediately determine how the bomb was detonated, whether by timer or remote control. But law enforcement officials quickly expressed their belief that the Chico was killed because of the way he had turned on Castellano and backed the plotter. The officials speculated that rivals of Gotti within the Gambino family considered him vulnerable and were openly trying to defy him. But the truth about what happened seemed to have been foreshadowed by Gaspipe Casso when he told the Chico that a plot against Castellano was fraught with danger. The other big bosses wouldn't stand for the killing of a sitting boss. Ultimately, Casso told his biographer and close childhood friend, Phil Carlo, that Gotti would have to pay a price. It was about 4 months after Castellano was murdered that Gigante set in motion plans to retaliate against Gotti in a meeting in Brooklyn, said Casso. Initially, Gravano had said in his biography that Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo didn't care if Castellano was killed. But according to Casso, it was Tony Dux who met with Gigante, and after their confab, it was said that Gotti had to be killed. Law enforcement officials said that Gambino captain Daniel Marino had been in talks with the Genovese family to have Gotti killed and for Jimmy Fila to be installed as the new boss with Gigante's blessing. The job, said Casso, was farmed out to Genovese soldiers in New Jersey, but they were unable to come up with a viable plan. Gotti was under too much police surveillance, and his Ravenite club was in an area of Manhattan that was too crowded. Gigante then looked elsewhere for help. According to Casso, Gigante allegedly turned to Herbert Pate, a former cop who was an explosives expert. Pate took on the job of crafting an explosive device from military-grade C4 explosive and electrical components from toy cars. Casso said he and Pate tested the device upstate, and on the day of the blast it was Pate who placed the bomb in a shopping bag under DeChico's car outside the Veterans and Friends Club. Then Pate and Casso observed the scene from the 19th Hole Club down the street and waited for DeChico and a man they thought was Gotti to exit the club. Casso's narrative and allegations of the bombing plot have never been corroborated by hard evidence. In some ways, the story Casso relates about the bombing seems a bit improbable. For instance, he claimed Pate drove past the bomb site as DeChico entered the car and then detonated the device. Such a move could be risky in that Pate's car, if his timing was off, could have caught some of the blast, which Casso said he did, and have been noticed by witnesses. But Casso's claim is all that history has left us with the bombing which killed DeChico. Even Gravano said that it was Casso who set up the bombing for Gigante, although he didn't know who actually carried it out. Pate was never charged in the killing, but instead convicted in 1988 of tax evasion, possession of firearms, and storing and concealing explosives following a conviction for a felony. He was sentenced to 12 years and fined $411,000. In his book Gaspipe, author Philip Carlo said that Gotti was viewed by some of the other bosses as a negative factor for the Mafia. He was seen as loud and brash and constantly flaunting his power. With Gotti's death, things would go back to normal. Of course, fate played out differently. The other Mafia bosses couldn't help but notice Gotti's public persona. Not only was he all over the newspaper since Castellano's murder, but his court cases kept him out front. In March, about a month before the DeChico bombing, Gotti finally showed up in the Queen's courtroom over the assault case involving Mr. Piecyk. The tabloids had a field day, chronicling the case as if it were a championship baseball game. Piecyk, the alleged victim in the case, had avoided police for weeks as they attempted to find him and bring him to court to testify. Finally, after Piecyk was found, he was brought in for a hearing in Queen's State Supreme Court. The prosecutor had a thankless task in trying to get his star witness to cooperate. During the 2-hour hearing, the 37-year-old Piecyk was asked the key question. Did he recognize the men who punched and slapped him during a traffic dispute on September 14, 1984? Piecyk's recollection failed him. I do not, answered Piecyk, as he glanced around at Gotti and his co-defendant, Frank Coletta. Asked if he remembered how the man who grabbed cash from his shirt pocket was dressed, Piecyk again demurred. To be perfectly honest, it was so long ago I don't remember, said Piecyk. Queens District Attorney John Santucci said that his office would try to introduce Piecyk's grand jury testimony, in which he had identified Gotti and Coletta. But it was clear that Piecyk had a convenient lapse of memory, so much so that one tabloid headline for the day trumpeted, "I forgot he." In the end, the case against Gotti and Coletta was dropped, since the victim's fear about the new crime boss had apparently got the best of him. Gotti's win in the assault case was the first of a number of courtroom victories, which went on to burnish his image as a man who could always beat the rap as the Teflon Don. It was soon after the Pietchik case victory and the DeCicco bombing that Gotti found himself in court again, in a case many had forgotten. U.S. v. Agnello della Croce et al. An indictment out of the Eastern District, or Brooklyn Federal Court as it is known, was easy to overlook with the looming and more publicized trials in the Pizza Connection and the Mafia Commission. Diane Giacalone was the prosecutor in the federal case. An intense woman, she had run afoul of her male counterparts in the high-achieving world of law enforcement by sticking to her guns and refusing to defer to the FBI, which wanted a better chance to make a run at Gotti. The FBI had the benefit of months of surveillance from the Ruggiero case, and it didn't share it with Giacalone, who had to rely on other witnesses to build her case. As the case neared a trial date, many in law enforcement didn't think she had a chance against some of the more seasoned members of the defense bar. She also had very little experience doing mob cases, having only one trial in the organized crime category. Usually, the Organized Crime Strike Force, a specialized unit, handled such cases with a group of specially trained federal prosecutors. Edward McDonald, the head of the Brooklyn Strike Force, complained to his superiors in Washington that Giacalone's evidence was weak and that a loss by the government at trial would effectively immunize Gotti from further prosecution for crimes committed prior to 1985. Still, Giacalone was able to keep the case and go to trial. The narrative circulating about Giacalone in news reports centered on how, as a young girl walking the streets of Queens outside the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, as a Catholic school student, she spied the old men loitering out front, who seemed to razz her over being skinny. Now the girl had matured into a seasoned federal prosecutor, who would be going after the very mafioso who once belittled her. It was a compelling part of the story, a young woman standing up against a horde of wise guys. But to make the case, Giacalone needed good evidence, something she thought she had. Right after the Pietchik case and the DeCicco murder, Giacalone made the unexpected move of asking Brooklyn federal judge Eugene Nickerson to revoke Gotti's $1 million bail and hold him for the duration of her trial. The argument Giacalone made was that since the DeCicco homicide, that the incentive for Gotti to retaliate was strong. She also contended that there was a strong possibility that Gotti and his crew would attempt to intimidate witnesses, something Giacalone said had occurred with Pietchik when the refrigerator repairman had received threatening telephone calls and other harassment during the pendency of Gotti's assault case. Bail revocations aren't made without some sort of hearing, and for several days in May, Judge Nickerson held a hearing in which he allowed Giacalone to bring in witnesses who could provide evidence of Gotti's mob ties and his dangerousness. One witness was Edward Magnuson, a Drug Enforcement Administration official, who had an informant who seemed to have some advanced but nonspecific information that something bad was going to happen about 3 or 4 days before DeCicco was killed. Once DeCicco died, the informant said that Gotti was very angry, and when he got out on bail, or when the trial was over, there was going to be a war and John would take his revenge, Magnuson testified. Gotti was being represented in the bail hearing by an aggressive attorney by the name of Bruce Cutler, who had represented the crime boss in the Pietchik assault case and was kept on for the federal case. In his bombastic style, Cutler called the government evidence a regurgitation of newspaper articles, scuttlebutt, and comic book gossip. However, Nickerson agreed with Giacalone and her co-counsel, John Gleason. On May 13, Nickerson revoked Gotti's bail and said that there was substantial evidence that Gotti would improperly influence or intimidate witnesses. Nickerson pointed to the Pietchik case and said there was significant evidence to show that Pietchik received a warning not to testify, and that it was clear the warning came from Gotti or others working for him. While he revoked Gotti's bail, Nickerson also stayed his order for a few days to give the defense time to appeal. But the appellate court decided that it wouldn't hold up Nickerson's order while the matter was on appeal, and decided that Gotti had to go off to jail. Gotti had already prepared himself for the eventuality that he might have to surrender, and had spent the weekend at home in which he was able to get his affairs in order and enjoy some last moments of freedom under the watchful eye of the FBI and a horde of newspapermen. Gotti showed up at the Brooklyn U.S. Attorney's office in a tan leisure suit and brown loafers and surrendered to a few cheers from onlookers. He was overheard by one reporter saying, "Ready for Freddy," a remark which some believed was a reference to the Undertaker character in the Lil Abner comic strip. But even in jail awaiting trial, Gotti was pretty much on top of things going on in the street. He had a group of close associates, Angelo Ruggiero, Joe Ramone, and Gravano, to run things and communicate with him in jail. The Gambino family rackets continued to generate cash, and the family didn't miss too much of the action. Although she had the backing of her bosses in Washington, Giacalone did not have an easy time getting the case against Gotti and the others ready for trial. Some of it stemmed from the lack of evidence, but some of the problems seemed of Giacalone's own doing. The case in point was the way she handled the case of Willie Boy Johnson, one of the defendants. For years, Johnson had been a secret informant of both the FBI and the Queens District Attorney's Office, feeding information and intelligence about Gotti and the Bergen crew. But in an attempt to try and get Johnson as a witness against Gotti, Giacalone threatened him with exposure as an informant. It was an astonishing and seemingly reckless gambit. Johnson protested and pleaded that if he testified at trial, that he and his family would likely be killed. The FBI also backed Johnson's bid to keep his informant status secret for obvious reasons. But Giacalone wouldn't budge, apparently thinking that if she exposed Johnson's status as a secret FBI mole, that he might then switch sides and testify. It was a gamble that failed. Johnson refused, and although Gotti told him that he didn't believe Giacalone's claim, the crime boss knew that Willie Boy would have to die at some point. Giacalone also tried to surface another FBI informant named Billy Batista, who had been an associate and bookmaker with the Bergen crew. In the case of Batista, who was handled with Agent Pat Colgan, the FBI put him up in a motel in New Jersey to keep him safe during the pendency of the trial. But Batista, knowing full well that his life was now in jeopardy, left the secret location and disappeared. He was never located, and not only did Giacalone lose a witness, the FBI had the usefulness of another informant ruined. If the FBI and Giacalone were having trouble in their working relationship, such as it was, Gotti seemed to be able to project his power in demands outside the confines of jail. A few weeks after Gotti was ordered to be detained before his trial, he issued an order to kill Robert DiBernardo, one of the captains who was part of the early plotting against Castellano. The message for the hit was passed from Gotti to Ruggiero, who then relayed it to Gravano to carry out. As Gravano remembered things, he was surprised, particularly since DiBernardo was earning a great deal of money for the crime family through the pornography business, and had been a liaison with some union officials. Gravano liked DiBernardo and admired his business sense. Gotti wanted DiBernardo killed because he had been talking behind people's backs or voicing what appeared to be insults. In one case, Gravano said that DiBernardo had told Ruggiero that he had the balls to be underboss, but not the brains. Gravano maintained it was just talk, and that DiBernardo, a captain without any crew of men, was essentially harmless. Gravano asked Ruggiero to see if Gotti would pull back the hit and then talk about it when he got out of jail. "Nothing doing," said Ruggiero. "Gotti wanted DiBernardo dead." "What was I going to do?" Gravano said years later. "What can I do? It's an order from the boss. This was the life I chose, and the boss was the boss." As Gravano would later describe in his biography and in court, the killing of DiBernardo took place at Gravano's office on Stillwell Avenue. The secretary had gone home at 5 p.m., and by the time DiBernardo showed up for a meeting, Gravano was there, as was his cousin, Eddie Garafola, and the loyal Joseph Peruta, the old man who had figured in the early planning in the Castellano hit. Gravano told Peruta to get DiBernardo a cup of coffee, and the old man walked over to a cabinet, where a .380 caliber handgun with a silencer had been secreted. Peruta took the weapon, walked over to the back of DiBernardo, and shot him in the head twice. "It was that simple," said Gravano. DiBernardo's corpse was placed in a body bag Gravano had obtained from a local Brooklyn funeral home and stored in a back room until the group cleaned up the office. Gravano then went to a local Burger King restaurant, where Ruggiero had been waiting, and told him that DiBernardo was dead, and that they should meet at Tally's later to dispose of the body and get rid of the dead captain's Mercedes. Gravano never did find out where DiBernardo's body was taken after it was put in the back of Frank Lucasio's Cadillac. As for the Mercedes, it was driven away by some young men connected to John Corneglia, perhaps to a junkyard. However, the Gotti racketeering trial before Judge Nickerson was not going away as easily as DiBernardo did. It would just get delayed a bit. In the face of the enormous publicity that Gotti and his co-defendants were receiving, particularly after the DeChico bombing, Nickerson decided that the trial, which was supposed to begin in late April, would be pushed back until mid-August. That should be enough time for the news coverage of the case to diminish and allow the court to set up procedures for selecting a jury, Nickerson said. His bail revoked, Gotti marked time in the federal lockup. But the others from the Bergen crew who had been charged in the case, including Angelo Ruggiero, John Carneglia and Gene Gotti, remained free, the latter on $1 million bonds and the restriction that they avoid mob social clubs and organized crime figures. However, more trouble soon faced Ruggiero. In June 1986, he was arrested in another racketeering case, this one involving numerous defendants, including the missing Robert DiBernardo, the nominal family underboss Joe Armone, James Fila, and Joe Engallo on charges of racketeering. The case was another mega indictment targeting the Gambino family and had the added twist with an allegation that the group had a source within the federal court system. Mildred Russo, the mother-in-law of Gambino associate Augustus Sclafani, had worked as a clerk in the Manhattan Federal Court, where among her duties she docketed search warrant affidavits. Russo, who looked like a matronly 66-year-old Italian grandmother, was allegedly passing along to the mob information from sealed documents she was supposed to be filing. In her normal duties, she worked with search warrant affidavits, which often spelled out the exact nature of the government's interest in an investigation. The author remembers Russo at times trying to deter him from reading the search warrant affidavits, which then were matters of public record. While law enforcement knew from intelligence that Gotti and his crew were involved in the Castellano murder, the new indictment involving Ruggiero gave officials an opportunity to spell out their suspicions on the public record. With Ruggiero facing 3 indictments now, the government again moved to oppose his bail. To do that, prosecutors brought in FBI Special Agent William C. Noon to testify. According to Bruce Mao's squad, Noon had been deeply involved in the Gambino crime family investigations and had access to the current intelligence, including what at least 6 informants within the Gambino crime family had been relaying back to their handlers within the FBI. According to Noon, the informants had said that both John Gotti and Ruggiero had orchestrated the killing of Castellano. The motive, Noon testified, was Castellano's earlier appointment of Bellotti in December 1985 as his underboss, instead of Gotti. Castellano also had learned that the bug in Ruggiero's Long Island home had given the government probable cause to place a surveillance device in his house on Staten Island, noted Noon. As interesting as Noon's information was, none of the informants had apparently placed Gotti or Ruggiero at the scene when Castellano and Bellotti were murdered. Defense attorney Jeffrey Hoffman, who represented Ruggiero, derided the information, calling it fallacious. Hoffman noted that the fact that his client had not been charged for the murders was proof of the pudding of his innocence in the homicide case. To buttress Noon's testimony, prosecutors played an excerpt from a surveillance tape in which Ruggiero was heard telling the now-dead Agnello Della Croce that their Gambino family faction might have to go to war with Castellano. The Castellano evidence wasn't the strongest in the world for a bail revocation, but it actually was Ruggiero himself who turned out to be his own worst enemy. Not only did he have loose lips and an almost compulsive need to talk, Ruggiero also had a tough time keeping his temper in check during court appearances. During an earlier hearing in 1985, Ruggiero pointed his finger at one witness in what the court said was a threatening manner. The judge saw the incident, but at the time didn't do anything about it. But at the bail revocation hearing on June 27 before the same judge, Ruggiero vented his anger at a U.S. Marshal after the official wouldn't let him visit with his son. "Come on, let's go. Go home and celebrate with your family," Ruggiero said with anger and sarcasm at the marshal. "Tell them what victory you got. Go ahead and laugh. I wish it on your wife and kids what you wish on my wife and kids." Then, as he was exiting the courtroom, Ruggiero turned to the prosecutor, pointed his finger in what officials said was a threatening manner, and barked, "You first." Judge Mark Constantino had enough. Not only had Ruggiero threatened a witness in court, but he did the same to a prosecutor. Constantino revoked the bail, noting that the informant evidence Noon had testified about, as well as the Della Croce tape, indicated Ruggiero was operating at a high level in organized crime. Ruggiero's bail was revoked. He appealed, but the appellate court was unmoved, noting, "The courtroom threats in the presence of the district judge are more than enough to justify revocation of bail. Threats made before a district judge have to be taken seriously," said the court. So now Gotti and Ruggiero are both being held in jail. Gotti's special committee to run the crime family was now missing one key man on the street, all because of Ruggiero's intemperate remarks before a judge. According to Gravano, when Ruggiero's bail was revoked, Gotti was beyond angry. "John is steaming," Gravano said later. "Blabbermouth Angie can forget being the underboss if he ever had a chance." Gotti picked Joey Piney Armone to the underboss position. But since Armone was elderly and not very tough, Gotti told Gravano to keep his hands on things, but as a courtesy to keep Armone informed. That move effectively made Gravano the underboss to those members on the street. As for Ruggiero, his costly outburst was another black mark against him in Gotti's eyes. With the trial date for Gotti coming up in the Giacalone case, Judge Nickerson had to wrestle with how to select a jury. Giacalone claimed that there was evidence that the defendants wanted to follow jurors to their homes and then contact jurors and their families for the purpose of corruptly influencing them. To combat that, Giacalone wanted Nickerson to sequester the jury, an extreme step, which would have meant that the jurors would have had to live away from home, guarded by federal marshals during the trial. In the end, in what would be a fateful decision, Nickerson shot down Giacalone's request for sequestration. The trial finally got underway on September 25, 1986, and with Gotti now as the lead defendant, it became a media spectacle. The courtroom of Judge Nickerson, in what is now the old Brooklyn Federal Courthouse, had every seat taken, with an estimated 25% being occupied by reporters and sketch artists. No cameras were allowed into the room. Giacalone, the prosecutor, told the jury that Gotti had killed to climb to the top of organized crime, a reference to the McBratney slang in 1974. The prosecutor's opening statement took about 90 minutes and immediately showed that Giacalone was trying to turn her case into a tutorial on organized crime, its structure, and its aims. Giacalone used a green chalkboard in the courtroom to sketch for the jury the structure of the Gambino crime family. Any seasoned cop or mob buff could see the diagram coming as she diagrammed how the boss sat at the top, advised by the consigliere, underneath whom there were captains and soldiers. At the bottom of the pyramid-like structure were eager associates, who Giacalone said wanted to become made members of the crime family. It's organized like a business, and where there's money to be made, you'll find the members of the Gambino crime family, Giacalone told jurors. She said Gotti and the other defendants played their own roles over 2 decades in the enterprise, from hijackings to gambling, loan sharking, and murder. To be sure, some of the government witnesses Giacalone planned to call had done their fair share of crimes, murders, kidnappings, and drug dealing. Admitting such witnesses were just horrible people, Giacalone told the jury to measure their testimony against the other proof, including wiretap conversations. The defendants may not have had the resources of the federal government, but they certainly had an array of seasoned and top-notch criminal defense attorneys. If Giacalone acted like a professor in talking to the jury, Gotti's attorney, Bruce Cutler, who had represented him in the Pietchik case, was a showman who could use props well. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he referred to Giacalone, who was dressed in a red suit, as the lady in red. Picking up a copy of the indictment, Cutler tossed it in a wastebasket in front of the jurors, saying, "It's garbage. That's where it belongs." Gotti, dressed in a double-breasted blue suit, a silk tie and white handkerchief in his breast pocket, seemed taken in by the dialogue. Cutler admitted that Gotti had a criminal past and didn't apologize for it. Gotti also didn't apologize for coming from a family of 11 surviving children that was dirt poor, said Cutler. Gotti made something of his life, and by wearing a nice suit he wasn't trying to be showy, but rather to show his pride, said Cutler. Barry Slotnick, a well-known defense attorney, who a year later would be catapulted to more fame defending subway gunman Bernard Goetz, represented John Carneglia and said the government had injected the mafia label into the case to prejudice the story. Giacalone's opening, said Slotnick, was like a script for a grade B crime movie. One of the very first witnesses for the government was Sal Polizzi, a Gambino associate, who, if he had aspirations to become a made man, never did. Instead, he turned into a government cooperator. Polizzi was a small-time thief and over time would parlay his experiences into a book and movie. But his literary ambitions caused the first of what would be many problems for the government. Giacalone had wanted to call Polizzi as her opening witness, but had to delay that after it became known that the mob associate had given an interview to a writer working on a book about him. That interview had been taped, and Giacalone had to provide the defense attorneys with copies of it in case there was anything said which might contradict what Polizzi said on the witness stand. Polizzi finally did testify and related how he hung out with the Gotti crew in the Bergen Club, sometimes gossiping or gambling and other times plotting crimes to commit. Polizzi's value to the government was to set the stage and inform the jury about what went on in the club. His testimony wasn't very dramatic, but since Polizzi was one of a number of informants the government had in the Gotti crew, he had first-hand information about some things. It was with the testimony of another witness that Giacalone's case started to show problems. It was part of the government's case that Jimmy McBratney had kidnapped a number of organized crime figures and had gone on to kill one of them. McBratney's own death was caused by Gotti as a favor to Carlo Gambino, and both Giacalone and John Gleason wanted to bring in testimony of another career criminal, Edward Maloney, to prove that point. But Maloney's information about Gotti's motive was much too tenuous and amounted to unacceptable hearsay. Said Judge Nickerson, far too thin. For most of the trial, Gotti had been rather well behaved, listening closely to the testimony. But in early November, as the trial was in its second month, things got testy. Victor Ruggiero, a retired NYPD detective, testified about surveillance he had done at the Ravenite Social Club in the late 1970s. Ruggiero wasn't the greatest witness in that he seemed evasive in giving answers on cross-examination. Suddenly, Giacalone called for a recess and for the jury to be taken from the courtroom. It was then that the prosecutor, whose case had suffered a number of nettlesome problems, told Nickerson that Gotti had been making sarcastic comments in a voice loud enough for me to hear quite distinctly. One Gotti murmuring was that ex-detective Ruggiero was testifying the way he did because the government had threatened him. "Your Honor, it's not true," Gotti told Nickerson. "Don't make comments," Nickerson replied. "But it's not true, Your Honor. If anybody is making comments, it's her," insisted Gotti, pointing at Giacalone. A thin, mild-mannered jurist with a genteel, patrician demeanor, Nickerson ended the discussion with an admonition to everyone in the courtroom. "Please don't say anything the jury can overhear." Nickerson was trying to make sure that the jury wouldn't be subjected to extraneous things which might hurt its impartiality or subject it to unwanted verbiage. But as it turned out, the mob was making an end run around Nickerson. No matter how strong or weak evidence might appear in the case, and in the Gotti trial the case seemed in trouble for the government, the end result could be unpredictable. A weak case could just as easily lead to a conviction, while overwhelming evidence of guilt could result in an acquittal. Such are the vagaries of jury deliberations. For Gotti's crew, the attitude was why take chances. Put the fix in with the jury as an insurance policy. During breaks in the case, the defendants who were out on bail would be able to walk around outside the courthouse into Cadman Plaza Park. At that time, a bit of down-on-the-heels urban green space, punctuated by the Brooklyn War Memorial. On one such preambulation, John Carneglia was with Kevin McMahon, a young man who Carneglia's family had adopted to save him a life of living on the streets of Howard Beach. They were headed towards a parking lot opposite the courthouse. McMahon had been in court watching the proceedings and noticed one of the jurors going to get his car. "Oh, there is one of your jurors," McMahon said to Carneglia. For reasons which were never entirely clear but must not have been good, McMahon wrote down the license plate of the juror's car and passed it along to a Gambino associate at the trial. McMahon did that with a few other juror license plates, and before long the associate, known as the Frog, had an insurance agent run the license numbers through the State Department of Motor Vehicles system to locate the names and addresses of the jurors. Another Gambino associate, who became a cooperating witness, related the same basic story as McMahon. Groups of Gambino associates would position themselves around the federal courthouse and await word that the jurors were coming out. Jurors would be followed to their cars, or else the van used by the marshals to transport the jurors to their cars would be followed, said the witness. Once the jurors' vehicles were identified, other associates would try and follow jurors to their homes. While it was never entirely clear if the license plate tactic entailing led to any solid opportunities to compromise the jurors, the Bergen crew learned that one of the anonymous jurors, George Pape, was a friend of a Gambino associate named Basko Radonjic, a Yugoslav gangster who, as fate would have it, was close with Gotti. Like the other jurors in the case, Pape had sworn that he would listen to the evidence fairly and without bias. But as soon as he got on the jury panel, according to the FBI, Pape contacted Radonjic and said he could be a holdout juror for the right price. Pape wanted $120,000 for performing his corrupt jury service. After all, the ex-Marine had money problems, and he had done his bit for his country already in the military. As Gambino family underboss, it fell upon Sammy Gravano to try and negotiate a better price with Pape. As Gravano would later explain things, the $120,000 seemed a high price. What if the juror became ill or had to be excused from the case? Gravano said he got Pape to accept $60,000, and the payment was passed along through Radonjic. Gotti was now assured that there would be at least one holdout in the case, leading to a mistrial. Giacalone, Gleason, and Nickerson, as well as, it seems, the defense attorneys, were in the dark about the machinations going on to corrupt the jury. The case slogged on with more government witnesses whose testimony amounted to a mixed blessing for the government. James Cardinale, a 37-year-old convicted killer, testified about hijackings, murders, and loan sharking, activities he tied Gotti to one way or another. But on cross-examination, Cardinale calls Giacalone one headache after another. At one point, Cardinale said he believed Giacalone had lied to him and acknowledged when questioned by Gene Gotti attorney Jeffrey Hoffman that he would absolutely lie, cheat, or steal to get what he wanted. In one embarrassing moment, and over the objection of Giacalone, Cardinale said that the prosecutor had told him that Nickerson treated her like a daughter, giving her anything she wanted while denying the same to the defense counsel. It didn't get much better for Giacalone the longer Cardinale stayed on the witness stand. Under questioning by Cutler, Cardinale admitted that he had told the defense investigator that from the day I met John Gotti, he did nothing but good for me. He put money in my pocket when I didn't have a dime. He put clothes on me. He's the finest man I've ever known. But the real cringeworthy moment for the prosecution came with the testimony of Matthew Traynor, a man Giacalone had once considered using as a witness but didn't after she caught him in a lie. Traynor was an old heroin dealer. Gotti had plenty of those around him. Bank robber and perjurer who first approached the government to cooperate as a way of getting his sentence reduced in a bank heist case. But when Giacalone cut him off, Traynor went to Cutler to be defense witness, and his testimony for Gotti represented a titillating moment in the case at Giacalone's expense. As a woman and the lead prosecutor, Giacalone had been the butt of much contempt by the defense. When Traynor testified, the sexual innuendo came out in a way that was unexpected. Traynor said that Giacalone had tried to induce him to lie about Gotti by giving him drugs such as Valium and codeine. During one visit to Giacalone's office, Traynor said he told her he wanted to get laid. Giacalone, Traynor claimed, pulled out a pair of her panties from her desk drawer and told him to masturbate with them. "Make do with these," Giacalone said, according to Traynor. Already stressed out with the way the case was going, Giacalone jumped up and protested, saying that what Traynor was saying was all lies. Not used to such courtroom histrionics, Nickerson was moved to say to Cutler and others on the defense, "This case is not going to turn any more of a circus than the defendant's attorneys have already made it." The case finally went to the jury on March 6, 1987, about 6½ months after the trial had started. It had been a tortured trial for the government, with witnesses embarrassing prosecutors and showing all sorts of credibility problems. The defense attorneys even prepared a chart showing how the main prosecution witnesses had admitted lying and the kinds of deals they got for their testimony. Privately, some government attorneys expressed doubt that the prosecution had a chance, despite the odds usually being in favor of the government in big trials. On March 13, 1987, the seventh day of deliberations, the jury signaled it had reached a verdict. In a hushed courtroom, the juror number 10, the jurors were anonymous for security reasons, announced the verdict of not guilty for Gotti and all his co-defendants, Gene Gotti, John Carneglia, Leonard DiMaria, Joseph Carrozzo, Anthony Rampino, and Willie Boy Johnson. As the verdict of acquittal was read to its conclusion, Gotti and the rest of the defendants hugged their attorneys. Then, as the jurors left the courtroom, the defendants and their supporters in the courtroom applauded. Giacalone and Gleason, the defeated prosecutors, looked glum. A scrum of reporters was in the courtroom and fired questions at Gotti and the lawyers over the railing at the well of the room. Gotti had some pat answers. "Shame on them. I would like to see a verdict on them," said Gotti, pointing at the empty prosecution table. Then, escorted by marshals, Gotti left to collect his belongings. He had been in custody since May, left the courthouse a free man to go back to her Howard Beach neighborhood, where the trees were decorated with yellow ribbons. Reporters did get a chance to ask one more question of Gotti before he went home. How did he beat the case? Gotti then pointed to the jury box and answered, "With these people here." He was certainly right about that, although the reporters had no way of appreciating the irony in Gotti's reply. Chapter 14. Tales of the Tapes, Part 1. With the acquittal in Brooklyn Federal Court, on top of the dismissal of the assault case involving Rommel Piechek in Queens, Gotti was quickly dubbed the Teflon Don in the media. He had an aura of invincibility about him. While the racketeering case in front of Judge Nickerson had been grinding on, the mafia bosses in the other New York families had not fared well at all. On November 19, 1986, In the commission trial taking place in Manhattan Federal Court, Genovese boss Anthony Salerno, Tony Dux Corallo, the head of the Lucchese family, and Carmine the Snake Persico, the boss of the Colombo family, were all convicted of a range of federal racketeering offenses, including the extortion of the construction industry through the Concrete Club scheme. Their associates Salvatore Tom Mick Santoro, Christy Tick Fernari, and Jerry Langella were convicted as well, along with union officials and Bruno Indelicato, the Bonanno associate who helped carry out the murder of Carmine Galante. Gotti was the last of the official bosses standing, although Philip Rostelli of the Bonanno family still faced a different set of charges and had not yet been convicted. Still, as the Teflon Don, Gotti was now swaggering around town, hitting the nightclubs and laughing at the government. He was good copy for the press, and with his stylish couture and expensive nightlife consuming Remy Martin Louis XVIII brandy, Gotti also became known as the Dapper Don. When his son, John A., got married, the reception at the Helmsley Palace, said to have cost $100,000, received media coverage as if it were a royal wedding. A fair complement of cops and agents also provided their own kind of coverage, watching the guests as they climbed the stairs inside the hotel to the ballroom. At the FBI offices in Queens, Bruce Mao and the rest of the special C-16 squad had sensed that the Brooklyn racketeering jury had been compromised before the verdict had been rendered. It seems that among the FBI stable of informants was a woman who was dating and sleeping with a Gambino associate. During some pillow talk, the woman learned from her lover that Gotti wasn't worried about a verdict because the jury had been compromised. But with only suspicion and no firm evidence, Brooklyn U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney kept silent and kept his own suspicion from Jack Alone and the rest of the trial team. As would later be uncovered in the government follow-up investigation, Pape remained a stubborn holdout for acquittal. But in a twist, Pape was apparently able to convince the other jurors that the government hadn't made its case and got the 11 others on the panel to vote for acquittal. As would later be reported, a majority of jurors had initially wanted to convict Gotti, but Pape was able to convince them to abandon their position. Pape would later be charged federally, convicted, and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for his corruption. Gotti had good reason to feel he had won a big battle, but the war had really just begun. It was in mid-1986 that the FBI got additional authorization from Washington to conduct intensive electronic surveillance of Gotti and his haunts. Time would tell what those tapes would turn up. Even with Gotti's acquittal, Tom Shear, a top FBI official in New York, said there would likely be additional efforts to indict him. Government records show that with the acquittal in Brooklyn, the FBI began to step up its efforts. Other problems also were facing the Gotti crew. The big heroin smuggling trial involving Angelo Ruggiero, John Carneglia, and others was set to begin in June in Brooklyn Federal Court as well, and the stakes in that case were as large as those had been in Gotti's trial. The Ruggiero case in Brooklyn with the heroin conspiracy was basically an FBI case made from evidence gleaned from the bug in his Cedarhurst house. His big mouth and lack of impulse control got Ruggiero a stint behind bars until the trial started. Mark Ryder, having dodged one bullet with the Thelma Grant heroin case and under indictment with Ruggiero in Brooklyn, just couldn't seem to control the need to continue dealing in more heroin. From January 1980 through fall of 1987, the Drug Enforcement Administration said that Ryder, Ruggiero, and a cadre of black heroin traffickers in Harlem worked together to move even more of the drug than the Bergen crew had done in Brooklyn. The allegations were significant because not only was Ryder tied to Gotti's crew, he was also turning out to be a major heroin source for Ruggiero and the Harlem Council of Dealers, which had been established by Nicky Barnes and others to control the Harlem operation over the years. With Gotti raking in money no matter what the source, it is fair to say that Ruggiero and Ryder were feeding his avarice, with cash earned from the misery drugs were causing throughout the city, particularly Harlem. By the time Ruggiero was getting ready to stand trial on the Brooklyn heroin case, the DEA and federal prosecutors had him as a defendant in another indictment, along with Ryder, mob associate Vito Leocano, and an impressive group of black gangsters who took over Barnes' old operation, including James Jackson, Raymond Clark, and over a dozen others. The government estimated that Ryder distributed about $10 million in heroin to Jackson, who marketed it on the street under the brand names Mellow Yellow, Purple Rain, and Murder One, the last name which had an ironic meaning given that 3 homicides were also pinned on some of the conspirators, although not Ruggiero. Since the Brooklyn heroin case had been indicted first, it was on deck for the first trial. In April 1987, Judge Mark Constantino began picking an anonymous jury, a practice used in other mob cases as a way of trying to shield the jurors from publicity and possible attempts to corrupt them. Given the experience in the earlier Gotti trial, the decision to keep the jurors' identity secret was a good one. While the original indictment charged 12 people in the drug case, the indictment grew in 1985 with the addition of the brothers Anthony and Cesar Guarino, owners of a plumbing company, who were accused of being part of a conspiracy to obstruct the grand jury probe into the whereabouts of Salvatore Ruggiero's assets. The Guarinos were not accused of participating in the drug operation. On June 1, 1987, the government and the defense gave their opening statements. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert LaRusso said the case was about drug trafficking and the substantial profit that was made from it. Although John Gotti was not a defendant in the case because there wasn't enough evidence to tie him into the trafficking, LaRusso injected his name by telling jurors that he was the boss of the main defendants, Angelo Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, and John Caneglia. Giving the jury a taste of what was to come, LaRusso said that there would be tapes made from the bug in Ruggiero's house. Even though the recordings had distracting background noise, such as that of jackhammers, children's chatter, and banging pots and pans, the jury would be able to hear Ruggiero talking about the purchase of at least 100 kilograms, 220 pounds of heroin with a street wholesale value of $150,000 a kilo, said LaRusso. The tapes were compelling pieces of evidence, so the defense, in its opening, sought to undercut them, claiming there were misleading fragments being used to bolster a case built on speculation and some unsavory government witnesses. John Pollock, who represented Ruggiero, put forward the theory that his client tried to find the assets of his dead brother, Salvatore, so that he might secure money for his son and daughter as their inheritance, a noble task. The evidence will show that upon his brother's death, he became consumed with overall ambition to see that his brother's assets went to his niece and nephew, said Pollock. Everybody discusses Salvatore's business, Pollock said of the over 80 FBI recordings to be played at the trial. But talking about his business and misdeeds is not a crime. Defense attorneys took issue with the way the government wanted to use recordings, sanitized of background noise and other electronic interference. Judge Constantino agreed, ordering that the original records should be played. Pollock made the argument to the jury that the transcripts being provided by the government of the recordings were slanted to mislead jurors and that the government's case was held together by the glue of speculation and surmise. One of the many tape recordings of Angelo Ruggiero captured him saying that the advice he had for anyone arrested who might be coerced into cooperating was, if they get pinched, tell them to lam it, meaning run away and hide. In early September, Mark Ryder, feeling the pressure of being on trial before Constantino and with another more serious indictment looming in Manhattan federal court, took that advice to heart and disappeared. What sparked Ryder's running, alleged investigators, was a telephone call from a jailed Ruggiero who told him that James Gator Jackson, one of the defendants in Ryder's Manhattan drug indictment, had been moved out of the federal lockup. That was a signal, prosecutors contended, that Jackson was cooperating, all of which spelled trouble for Ryder. Since Ryder was already out on bail during the Brooklyn trial, he simply had to take off from his pricey third-floor apartment on 60th Street for parts unknown. As the trial moved forward without Ryder, a team of DEA and FBI agents, as well as NYPD detectives, created a small task force to find the fugitive. Ryder had hid his tracks well, but like anyone on the run, he needed to keep in touch with friends and his attorneys. Investigators pulled records of Ryder's calls and noticed numbers in California, around the upscale area of Marin County. Tracking one of the numbers, a surveillance team watched a house in the area and spotted Ryder exiting the building, which was the home of a friend. Trailing Ryder, the team followed him to a Holiday Inn motel, and it was there they arrested him on November 18, 1987. The team of investigators on Ryder's tail had come from the DEA, the FBI, and the NYPD, which were still probing the homicide of Paul Castellano. According to one member of the team, the NYPD and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office were convinced that Ryder had information about Gotti's involvement in the Castellano hit, and spent about 4 days trying to convince Ryder to cooperate. The aim of the cooperation attempt was to get Ryder, who everybody knew was close with Gotti, to talk about what he may have heard at the Bergen Club about the crime boss's involvement in the assassination. which at that point was still very much an unsolved case. But Ryder proved to be a stand-up guy, which in mob parlance meant he didn't crumble under the pressure and refused to cooperate with the agents, even though it is unlikely that he knew anything of value about the murder. He was then brought back to New York after having been on the lam for about 2 months. Ryder's loyalty to Gotti was severely misplaced. A few years later, it was revealed that Gotti, fearing that Ryder might cooperate, wanted him killed if he could be found. The same was true for Anthony Rapino, one of the shooters in the Castellano murder. Gotti suspected Rampino as well might cooperate, and as it turned out, Gotti's fear was justified. Rampino, after his arrest in November 1988 on a state drug case, entertained cooperating. In Brooklyn, the heroin case continued with the parade of government witnesses and the playing of scores of audio tapes made off the Ruggiero bug. With 11 defendants, the case was slow going. But by the fall, whatever had been going on in the courtroom started to take a back seat to what the defendants appeared to be doing outside the building. If the first attempt to corrupt the jury had worked so well in the Jack Alone case, why not try it again? Federal prosecutors in Brooklyn had already started an investigation into whether the jury in the Jack Alone case had been compromised when investigators learned from confidential sources of similar efforts in the big Ruggiero heroin case before Judge Constantino. Former FBI Supervisor Bruce Mao told the author that associates of some of the defendants, later identified in court records as John Carneglia, Gene Gotti, Edward Lino, and Angelo Ruggiero, carried out the same tactics Kevin McMahon had suggested in the Jack Alone case. Watch the jurors at the end of the day as they retrieved their cars from the parking lot across Cadman Plaza Park. Jot down their license plate numbers, find their identities, and then see if they could be approached. 2 private investigators were used to identify the jurors. Brooklyn Federal Court records later identified them as John Sewell, who failed in the task, and Victor Giuliano, who apparently succeeded. According to informants, the identities of at least 5 of the jurors had been discovered, and that one of the black jurors had been approached and now compromised. Things got worse when one of the jurors, easily identified through his conspicuous vanity license plate, was found to live just a few doors away from men associated with the defendants. The information about the jurors triggered another grand jury investigation in December into possible jury tampering. An unexpected development then occurred when one of the jurors had to be excused from serving after it was learned he was not a U.S. citizen. 2 days after being removed from the jury, the now ex-juror was telephoned by a co-worker, Mel Rosenberg, who had a strange conversation about the drug case. According to court records, Rosenberg said he was a friend of Gene Gotti and offered the juror, Gary Barnes, a new BMW if he could say how the jury was feeling about the case. Since both Barnes and Rosenberg worked for a financial company where telephone calls were routinely taped, some of Rosenberg's initial cryptic approaches to Barnes were recorded and proved useful for the government investigation. By early January 1988, the government presented Constantino with evidence about the jury tampering efforts. What followed were a series of unusual court sessions in which the government wanted Constantino to question all of the jurors and keep all of the proceedings on the issue secret and closed to the news media. Constantino decided not to question all of the jurors, and then decided to allow the press access to a hearing about the tampering allegations. What transpired showed the way how even the suggestion of jury tampering was damaging the sanctity of the whole court process. Constantino heard testimony from Barnes, who repeated the story about the way Rosenberg had contacted him, insisted on talking with him, and then mentioned how familiar he had been with Gene Gotti. Rosenberg, according to Barnes, couched his familiarity with Gotti by saying, "I've known this kid for 42 years. I've known his family. We are good friends." In other words, to that effect. As retold by Barnes, who by that time was no longer on the jury, Rosenberg kept incorrectly stating that he had been on a jury in Queens, when in fact the case was in Brooklyn. In further questioning of some of the remaining jurors in open court, Constantino learned some troubling information which, while not proof of any actual corruption of the jurors, raised serious questions about their ability to be impartial. One juror, juror number 4, told Constantino that his parents had fears and that he wasn't sure if he could remain impartial. Juror number 8 said he had heard of the allegations of jury tampering in media reports, and after seeing that the case had so much evidence about drugs, a subject he said he couldn't be objective about because of family experiences, thought that raised a problem about his impartiality. A woman, juror number 12, stated to Constantino that she was not sure she could remain impartial because she had divined, from all of the delays in the case, that something fishy was going on. The only thing is that I kind of have an idea on what this is all about, and it is kind of changing my input as to whether I can be impartial or not, she said. None of those sitting jurors said that anyone had actually approached them to influence their deliberations. But prosecutors asked Constantino to call a mistrial and start the case from scratch. There just weren't enough qualified jurors left to continue hearing the evidence, the prosecution said, particularly with the defense asking that jurors 4, 8, and 12 be dismissed. Constantino had a tough decision to make, whether to scuttle the trial after so much time had been spent in court already, or continue with a depleted jury pool and risk a reversal if the trial resulted in convictions. But then on January 19, 1988, an unusual event took place in the courthouse. The entire group of sitting judges convened an en banc hearing to consider if the government simply made charges about jury tampering to force a mistrial because the case was going well for the defendants. Having all of the judges in a courthouse come together to hear evidence was a very rare thing for federal district courts, but it was permissible under the law, even if it had never happened in Brooklyn. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Jack B. Weinstein, a tall, distinguished jurist who was one of the senior judges in the courthouse, having been appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson to the bench in 1967. A former Navy submarine commander in World War II, Weinstein loved to be in charge of things and once said he ran his own courtroom as if he was its commander. Weinstein, accompanied on the bench by 8 other Brooklyn federal judges, called the case at 1 p.m. "We'll hear from the government first," Weinstein said. Brooklyn U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney had the floor and asked Weinstein to exclude the public from the courtroom because the jury wasn't sequestered and might learn of the sensitive matters being discussed at the hearing. But Weinstein thought Judge Constantino had to deal with the issue of sequestration and thought it was inappropriate to exclude the public, so he denied Maloney's request. Because the hearing dealt with sealed records in a grand jury proceeding, the colloquy between the lawyers and the judge in what everybody agreed was an extraordinary hearing was a bit strained since the public was in the courtroom. But Maloney indicated for the first time on the public record that the investigation had to do with jury tampering. Since the FBI was concerned that its confidential sources might be revealed, endangering their lives, Maloney got the court to accept all documents and grand jury materials in confidence, with the judges themselves writing confidential on the material because the prosecutors hadn't had time to do it before the hearing. Turning to the defense attorneys, Weinstein said that he gathered their position was that the government essentially was trying to sabotage the trial by raising the issue of jury tampering in bad faith, thereby forcing a mistrial. Attorney Ronald P. Fischetti, who represented Gene Gotti, agreed with Weinstein's characterization, but didn't want to reveal too much in such a public forum. But Fischetti said there had been nothing shown in the trial court hearing which indicated that any of the jurors had been improperly approached. At the hearing, Your Honor, that was conducted in open court, the evidence that was submitted by the government, in our judgment, was woefully inadequate and did not reach the standard that the court would reach in order to determine jury tampering, said Fischetti. Fischetti also disputed the prosecution's view that the evidence against the defendant was overwhelming, and thus provided a motive for jury tampering. There simply was nothing in the government's claims about jury tampering which indicated what a defense would be against the indictment. "We have not had, if I may say, our turn at bat," argued Fischetti, stressing that the defendants didn't want a mistrial and believed they could continue with the case. The defense attorneys had made clear earlier that they would oppose any mistrial on the grounds that it would expose their clients to double jeopardy. Weinstein and the other judges decided that the government had in good faith brought the allegation that some defendants had tampered with jurors. That ruling cleared the way for Constantino to finally decide that the government allegations of tampering compelled him to declare a mistrial. He also unsealed some of the government records, which had stated one juror was approached and now compromised. Maloney was asked by reporters what was meant by the word compromised, and his answer was blunt: bought and paid for, in the bag. Maloney was prepared to start the retrial immediately and also revealed that the allegations of jury tampering in the case, as well as claims about similar tampering in the Jack Malone trial, were undergoing a grand jury investigation. The probes were going to get very hot, Maloney said. The defense attorneys stuck to their argument that any retrial would be double jeopardy since the government had caused the mistrial. The actual calling of the mistrial came after Constantino told jurors 4, 8, and 12 that they were excused. He then replaced 2 of them with alternates. But that still left only 11 jurors, not the 12 normally seated in a case. Because of that, Constantino called a mistrial and thanked all of the jurors for their service. His only explanation to the now dismissed jury about what had happened to lead to the mistrial was serious matters came before this court. Gene Gotti seemed incredulous about what had happened. Fischetti told reporters that his client couldn't get a fair trial now, since future jurors would be afraid to vote for an acquittal, thinking they might be accused of having been tampered with. Ruggiero's attorney, Jeffrey Hoffman, sounded bitter, saying the government had accomplished its goal of getting a mistrial. The government did not want the jury to vote in this case, said Hoffman, and as a result, the publicity caused by the unsupported charges of jury tampering allowed the government to succeed. Constantino unsealed some of the government documents, and they alleged that Carneglia, Gene Gotti, Ruggiero, and Lino had learned the identities of at least 5 of the anonymous jurors for the purpose of fixing this case, and have compromised one of the jurors who is presently on the panel. So months of trial went out the window. 10 defendants would all have to stand trial again. Oscar Ansurian, John Carneglia, Gene Gotti, brothers Anthony and Cesar Guarino, Edward Lino, Canadian gangster Joseph Lopresti, Anthony Muscatello, the wandering Mark Ryder, and Angelo Ruggiero. But Constantino wasn't going to have to see their faces again. He had taken senior status in December and decided to pass on handling the retrial. The case was assigned to Judge Joseph McLaughlin, one of the relatively new members of the court's bench. McLaughlin inherited a mess, and to make it more manageable, he divided the case up in 4 parts, with Gotti, Carneglia, and Ruggiero together in one major piece. Prosecutors immediately tried to get Gotti's bail revoked, but McLaughlin ruled that there wasn't enough evidence that Gotti had asked Rosenberg to approach the juror Barnes, so Gotti and Carneglia remained free, as did most of the other defendants. Not all of the defendants had been suspected of jury tampering, and 6 of them, including Ryder and the Guarino brothers, thought any attempt to retry them would be double jeopardy and wanted the case dismissed. But McLaughlin ruled against them, finding that there really wasn't any way that the court could salvage the original jury for some of the defendants. Michael Coro, the attorney who fancied himself a gangster, also saw his case severed from the rest, and he would be tried separately on several counts of obstruction of justice. Chapter 15. Tales of the Tapes, Part 2. Alfred Delantage, the once high-flying aviation entrepreneur and drug dealer, had found himself in a very disagreeable place after his arrest on a cocaine charge in Louisiana. Angola was the name not of the African country, but rather the location of Louisiana's maximum security prison, dubbed the Alcatraz of the South. It had an inmate population of thousands and is said to be the largest maximum security facility in the country. It also had a terrible reputation for violence, hard labor, and a climate that could stifle anyone. Some authors, decades earlier, noted that Angola was probably as close to slavery as any person could come in 1930, and that even hardened criminals cried when they heard they were going to be doing time there. Things may have improved by the time Delantage arrived in Angola in January 1983 to await trial for the cocaine bust. It had a prisoner newspaper known as the Angolite, an FM radio station, and television programming. But no matter how Angola was spruced up, Delantage still wanted out. So when Bruce Mowell, supervisor of the FBI's Gambino squad, sent agents down to Louisiana to see if he wanted to cooperate, well, Delantage jumped at the idea. It was goodbye Angola and hello witness protection. Delantage and to a lesser extent Wayne DeBaney were important witnesses for the government in the heroin case against Angelo Ruggiero and Company. True, Delantage wasn't a major babanya dealer. He preferred marijuana, but he had dealt with Ruggiero in filling him in on what his brother Salvatore had been doing, where his assets were, and some of the property he owned. Delantage was also present for certain key conversations, as Ruggiero tried to reconstruct Salvatore's operation, and with the help of Coro, obstruct the grand jury investigation into the drug dealing. In terms of making the case, Delantage could provide some of the glue to stitch things together. He could help prosecutors interpret some of the tapes made at Angelo's house and give important context. Delantage also had evidence useful by the government against Ansurian. It was no secret that Delantash and DeBaney were going to testify in the Ruggiero case, since the news media had publicized their cooperation just before the first trial started. Both men had much to say, but it was Delantash who provided the prosecution and the jury with important context, laying the groundwork for the drug business Salvatore Ruggiero had set up. According to Delantash, it was late 1978 when he was introduced to Sal Ruggiero, who along with another man wanted him to provide a plane to bring a load of heroin into the U.S. from Pakistan. Delantash agreed to provide the aircraft and the pilot, who happened to be George Morton, and the deal was set. According to a November 2014 story about Delantash on the website Narratively, written by Jeff Maish, he only knew Ruggiero by his pseudonym, Steve Terry, and wouldn't learn about his mafia connections until later. But the $150,000 Ruggiero dangled in front of Delantash was enough of an enticement to try heroin smuggling. But according to Delantash, the Pakistan deal fell through after the heroin supplier there got busted by Pakistani authorities. Then, recalled Delantash, Ruggiero introduced him to a contact in the marijuana business, and the three men agreed in June 1979 to attempt to fly about 10,000 pounds of marijuana into Florida. But this second venture was also star-crossed. The plane developed mechanical problems and was forced to land in Melbourne, Florida, and the load of pot was seized. A few days later, Delantash's close friend, Wayne DeBaney, pilot Morton, and their business partner in the drug deal were arrested for the ditched load. While DeBaney was cooling his heels in a Florida jail cell, he was visited by an attorney he had never met before, Michael Coro of New York. In their statements to the government and at trial, DeBaney and Delantash said that Coro said he was brought into the case by Sal Ruggiero, who at that point, while living in Florida, was actually a fugitive from New York, on the lam in 3 cases: heroin smuggling, hijacking, and tax evasion. Coro was able to get bail for DeBaney, but the defendant decided to have another lawyer represent him at trial, where he, Morton, and all the other defendants, save one, were acquitted. Having dodged another bullet with a marijuana seizure, Delantash must have been feeling invulnerable. He agreed after the acquittal of his sidekicks to team up with Sal Ruggiero and Oscar Ansurian, another mob-connected drug dealer, to bring in more marijuana loads. So from about July 1980 through June 1981, Delantash told prosecutors, the group flew in about 28 loads of marijuana, about 2,500 pounds a load, to Millville, New Jersey. In his interview with author Maish, Delantash said his supplier was Carlo Lederer, the former Colombian drug lord, who he met at a Miami restaurant with Ruggiero. As Delantash related to Maish, he took some $40,000 in bribe money to spread among government officials, customs officers, and the military in places like the Bahamas and Colombia to assure he had safe passage. Back in Millville, where Delantash used an old World War II vintage hangar for his planes, the cargo was then taken by van to Westchester County, where Delantash grew up, and distributed throughout the New York metropolitan area. Part of one load even made it to John Carneglia's junkyard in East New York. Each load, said Delantash to the FBI, brought in $75,000, which was split between himself, Ruggiero, and Ansurian. The marijuana business was going well until, in the summer of 1981, when one of the customers was arrested in Boston. It was then that the smugglers decided to suspend the flights into New Jersey until it seemed safer. By early 1982, Ruggiero, Delantash, and Ansurian began talking about reviving the marijuana business, but in the end, according to Delantash, decided against it. It seemed that Ruggiero owed Delantash a great deal of money for prior marijuana shipments and didn't want to pay, likely because he was a bit strapped for cash, given the demands of his fugitive lifestyle. Ruggiero and his friends in the Gambino crime family saw more profit potential in heroin, so they called off their discussions with Delantash about marijuana and tried to convince him to fly in heroin. Delantash was reluctant to do that. It seemed too risky. Despite several meetings, which were amicable, Delantash told investigators that he didn't want to get involved at that point in shipping heroin on his planes. But the fact that Delantash may have had cold feet about the heroin trade didn't stop others in the Gambino crime family from trying to forge drug connections. During one February 23, 1982 surveillance, FBI agents spotted John Carneglia and Angela Ruggiero travel to New Jersey, where they visited mob-connected drug connections, El Francisca and Arnold Squidieri. Both men lived in the high-income town of Englewood Cliff, and it was there that Ruggiero and Carneglia were seen by FBI surveillance teams. Squidieri was a known heroin dealer, with 2 convictions for heroin distribution in the 1950s, a first-degree manslaughter conviction, and one for income tax evasion, FBI record showed. In other words, Squitieri had a good resume for mob life. But the fact that he had been nabbed and convicted on drug charges was a roadblock to his attempts to become a soldier in the Gambino family. Siska, an associate of the Lucchese crime family, was considered by the DEA to be a major narcotics violator, with a 1973 conviction for distributing over 26 pounds of heroin, which netted him a 12-year prison sentence. It was unclear what Ruggiero and Corneglia discussed with Siska and Squitieri at their meeting. The FBI had a bug operating on Ruggiero's house, but the tapes didn't provide insight into the subject of the meeting. But a little over a week after the Englewood Cliffs meeting, Ruggiero and Squitieri were surveilled meeting in Queens at a deli by the intersection of Linden Boulevard and 79th Street. After the meeting, Squitieri and an unidentified man he was traveling with got into their car, with the unknown man holding what appeared to be a package in his jacket. Was it drugs? The FBI seemed to think so. As a fugitive, Sal Ruggiero had a lot on his plate. He not only had to live a secret life, but he had a wife and 2 children to take care of. That he managed to do so by making money, both legal and illegal, showed how industrious and careful he could be. He had the drug business for certain, but there are also legitimate holdings, which Sal Ruggiero had, which were held through a carefully constructed web of people who acted as fronts. He had Michael Coro, the lawyer, to thank for some of that. As stressful as the life of a fugitive could be, Sal Ruggiero did his best to try and give some normal existence to his children. In early April 1982, he flew down to Florida with his son in Delantash's Learjet for a Disney World vacation. It was kind of a male bonding experience, since neither Ruggiero's wife Stephanie nor the couple's daughter traveled with father and son. But Ruggiero's interest in Florida went beyond amusement. Ruggiero took another trip in April 1982 to Disney World in the Learjet to meet up with Oscar Ansorian to arrange a heroin transaction, according to Delantash's testimony, his FBI debriefing, and records of the amusement park. The earlier trip by Ruggiero with his son might very well have been a reconnaissance for the heroin trip, although that will never be known. While in Florida, Ruggiero heard from Delantash, who had some troubling news. A New Jersey State police officer had visited Delantash to inquire about the Learjet and its pilot, George Morton. That was not a good sign, and after the cop left, Delantash contacted Ruggiero to tell him not to fly back in the jet. Things were too hot. Ruggiero disregarded that warning and came back on the jet. He actually wasn't in any danger of being caught doing anything, since he had no drugs with him. Instead, Ansorian drove the 1,500 or so miles from Florida to New Jersey with 26 pounds of heroin in his car. There was always the risk that Ansorian would be stopped by an aggressive highway patrol officer somewhere and the heroin possibly discovered, but that didn't happen and the drugs got back north. Delantash's testimony and information wasn't the only evidence. Months of surveillance of Angelo Ruggiero's house in Cedarhurst had led to hours of incriminating recordings. One Saturday afternoon, about a week before his brother Sale died in the crash of the Learjet, Angelo was visited by Gerlando Sasha, the Canadian gangster and drug trafficker who bragged that "I got 30 things of heroin. That's why I'm here." It was heroin Sasha wanted to give to Sal Ruggiero, as much as 40 kilos. When Angelo heard that, he said, "Oh, yeah," with a mix of incredulity and uncertainty. "I've got to speak to my brother," said Angelo. These conversations, which took place in the week before Salvatore's death, undercut the argument by the defense that it was only after the fatal plane crash that Angelo started to busy himself with his brother's narcotics activities. Clearly, as the Sasha conversation showed, Angelo was working in conjunction with Salvatore as a conduit for potential sellers of heroin. There were other conversations along the same line, picked up by the FBI bug, including on April 30, 1982, in which Edward Lino told Angelo about an impending heroin shipment which he wanted to give Ruggiero a first crack at. In this conversation, Ruggiero told Lino not to use the airplanes to move the drugs because of government surveillance in the air. These were hardly conversations of a man unfamiliar with the drug rackets. Yet Ruggiero's defense attorney and the other lawyers saw the tapes as an Achilles heel of the government's case. There were 239 recordings played at the trial, some 89 picked up by the FBI bug in Angelo Ruggiero's house on Long Island. But to the defense attorneys, there was an indication in the quality of the tapes, which they exploited to argue that they were tampered with by the FBI. In some cases, the playback of the recordings seemed to have the volume manipulated, the attorneys argued. Given the worst interpretation by the government, the tapes caught Angelo talking somewhat cryptically about what appeared to be drug prices. In one case, Angelo references his brother and says, "My brother was getting it from 135, and noted that my brother brought him, George, Shasha, up to date about everything." In other recordings, Angelo talked about dividing up kilo loads, giving one to Siska of New Jersey and some to Ryder, who he kept referring to as Jew Boy. On July 21, the case went to closing arguments, with Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert LaRusso saying that Corneglia, Ruggiero, and Gene Gotti were supervisors, organizers, and managers of the heroin operation which brought in hundreds of kilos from Southeast Asia. "They are the managers who don't take risks, who sit in their house, while others do their work in the street," said LaRusso. Money was the driving force for the three defendants, and the evidence was clear in showing that, the prosecutor argued to the jury. Ruggiero's attorney, Jeffrey Hoffman, hit the tape tampering argument hard and asked the jurors that even if they didn't like his client's lifestyle, that he shouldn't be convicted for that. "I ask you not to accept this terribly flawed case," Hoffman said. Ronald Fischetti, who represented Gene Gotti, not only hit the tape tampering issue, but pointed out that not one witness could take the stand and say that Gotti was a drug dealer. Well, that was the case in the Brooklyn trial, perhaps, but across the Hudson River, in a different federal courtroom, another jury had heard evidence which implicated the Bergen crew in heroin. Arnold Scudieri and Alphonse Siska, the two Englewood Cliffs men Ruggiero and Corneglia had visited in 1982, were convicted of conspiring with the Bergen men, including Gene Gotti, of distributing and selling heroin. In the New Jersey trial, the key witness was Richard Pasqua, a former heroin dealer who became a federal witness. Pasqua claimed in testimony that at one point in October 1981 that Siska had bragged he was part of the Gotti organization and that he could get as much as $3 million from John Gotti to buy heroin. Pasqua also said he bought $180,000 from Siska and Scudieri. The evidence in the New Jersey case was, of course, incriminating for the Brooklyn defendants, but it was kept away from the jury in the Ruggiero trial. In Brooklyn, the jury deliberation went on for 7 days, which in a federal case is a long time. Despite hundreds of tapes, drug-dealing witnesses like Delantash, and the testimony of FBI agents, the jurors sent out a note saying they were deadlocked. At 11:45 on July 27, the jury sent a note to Judge McLaughlin, which said, "After breaking yesterday, we gave serious thought to where we were heading. It amounted to nowhere." No matter how hard they tried, the jurors felt they wouldn't reach a verdict with any more deliberations. Faced with such a note, McLaughlin called a mistrial. It was a decision which pleased no one. Corneglia seemed bitter as he told reporters, "Sure, I am upset. This case was over downstairs in the first trial, and it's over here. Their theory is if Denver plays Washington enough times, Denver might eventually win." The latter reference was to the miserable record of the Denver Broncos football team compared to that of the Washington Redskins. "I feel empty, having been with it for so long and not having a resolution," said a downcast and disappointed LaRusso. Gene Gotti and Ruggiero were feeling the stress of being in legal limbo, particularly Ruggiero, who was still being held without bail. A few days after the mistrial was announced, the jury foreman talked to reporters and kept his identity confidential. The tapes, the foreman said, were the problem for the jurors. At one point, the jurors, by a show of hands, voted on the reliability of the FBI tapes, and it was clear that the issue was far from clear. 7 felt there was no tampering, and 5 felt the possibility existed, not that they actually did it, stated the foreman. "We didn't try to pinpoint who or what caused the tampering. We realized after 7 days of replaying the tapes, we were beyond the point where we could agree on the tapes." Years later, LaRusso said that he had wanted the court to give the jurors both the tapes and transcripts of the recordings to aid the jurors in their listening. But McLaughlin decided to give the jurors the option of listening to the tapes with or without the transcripts. This, prosecutors believed, caused some of the confusion with the jurors about the tape's reliability. After the mistrial was announced, Brooklyn U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney said that the way the jurors seemed to accept the defense claims that the recordings were tampered with made the jury seem like gullible tourists who could eventually be sold the Brooklyn Bridge. The jury foreman didn't like Maloney's criticism and opined that he thought the government would have a hard time convincing a new jury. The foreman was also critical of the way FBI agent William Noon played the recordings in court, seeming to raise the volume at some to have the jurors hear what he wanted them to hear. But Maloney was set on trying the case a third time, and McLaughlin set September 7 as a tentative trial date. The judge did cut Ruggiero a break, granting him a $1 million bail after the mistrial, McLaughlin also wanted to make sure Ruggiero didn't get involved in any mob activity while free, in order that he not associate with his co-defendants, except when he needed to plan legal strategy. He also told Ruggiero to stay away from any alleged members of the Gambino crime family. For whatever reason, McLaughlin was not going to handle the retrial of the Bergen crew. Instead, the case was assigned to Judge John Bartels, who, at the age of 91, was the oldest jurist in the Brooklyn courthouse. The case would remain in a holding pattern for several months, and it was not until April 1989 that, with Ruggiero becoming progressively sicker from cancer and requiring surgery, that Bartels decided to sever him from the case. The court just couldn't wait the 2 or 3 months that it might require Ruggiero to recuperate. Bartels said he wanted to get the case over with and knew that Gene Gotti and John Carneglia wanted the same. While much of the public attention in 1987 and 1988 was focused on the Gambino crime family and the heroin trial, there was much going on behind the scenes with the FBI. The Bureau didn't stop its probe into the Bergen crew and the rest of the crime family. Far from it. With Gotti very much the public face of the mob and taunting the cops with his very public persona after his acquittal in the Jacqueline case, the FBI began to intensify its investigation by getting authorization from the Department of Justice to conduct extensive electronic surveillance of Gotti and his men. After all, the heroin case surveillance effectively ended in July 1982 with the FBI, but Gotti's operation continued to grow and assert itself after he became boss for all practical purposes in December 1985. Things were happening, and the FBI informants were giving Mao and his agents plenty of ammunition to target Gotti for additional electronic surveillance warrants. The Gotti crew was considered a national priority by the FBI, and the spigot for money was opened, although by modern standards the amounts weren't very much, perhaps $20,000 a crack, according to FBI records. By 1987, Gotti and the Bergen boys were given top priority out of New York, where it was soon learned that he had offices in the Manhattan Garment District, namely at the companies of Louis Kasman. The garment industry had long been a mob bailiwick, and for the Gambino family in particular. The now shelved underboss Joe Angallo controlled the Greater Blouse Association, a trade group, along with 2 other mafia families. Thomas Gambino had interests in major garment trucking companies, and mob loan sharks provided cash-strapped manufacturers with usurious loans, often leading to organized crime takeovers of a company. For Gotti, he was linked by investigators to Kasman's Scorpio Marketing and Albee Trimming Companies, 2 garment district firms, which was a way of providing him with a source of seemingly legitimate income. Kasman, who was Gotti's confidant and considered the mob boss's adopted son, was only too happy to accommodate him and served as an unofficial chief of staff. Mao and his investigators in New York were, as one FBI memo stated, to be given all manpower and support personnel that will be needed to carry out what was planned to be a massive wiretapping and electronic surveillance of Gotti and his upper echelon bosses. Running the investigation on the prosecution side was Brooklyn U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney and his strike force chief, Laura Bravetti, all of whom thought bugs and wiretaps were the way to go to get Gotti. Over time, the investigation, codenamed Hatter, focused on Gotti's haunts all around the city, the Garment District, the Bergen Hunted Fish Club, and the Ravenite Social Club. Of course, Gotti had made it easy for the FBI spies because of the way he demanded his hierarchy and captains show up at the Ravenite. Gravano would later rail against this move by Gotti, and with good reason. FBI records showed how Gotti conducted much of his business at the Ravenite in walk-and-talk conversations outside the club, away from any bug inside. Gotti, being surveillance-conscious, frustrated the agents with his outdoor way of doing business. FBI officials, according to internal agency memos, believed they weren't getting fruitful results from the electronic surveillance. Limited success was how they characterized the results. The stage was now set for some more inventive surveillance techniques, beyond the usual wiretaps and bugs of Gotti's usual circuit. Agents had a number of places to spy on for Gotti, but needed to figure out which location was the best to plant a bug to listen to his criminal conversations. They finally settled on the Ravenite Club, and it was there that the FBI black bag team entered one night and planted a listening device. But the acoustics in the club were terrible. The espresso machine would be hissing in the background. A soda machine was constantly in use, and with a number of conversations going on around Gotti, agents had a hard time discerning what was being said. The FBI team tried moving the bugging device around to different locations, and even used special audio filters to take away extraneous sound. But it was to no avail. After months of frustration, Mao and the FBI team learned from an informant that Gotti would often leave the confines of the club and talk to captains like Thomas Gambino in a back hallway. Then the informant discovered that Gotti would take people out of the hallway to an apartment upstairs in the building at 247 Mulberry Street. After some more discreet snooping, the informant reported back that Gotti was using the apartment of a widow, Nettie Sorelli, to hold meetings. The widow's husband had been Michael Sorelli, a Gambino soldier, and the apartment had been used by Della Croce for secret meetings when he was alive. So the FBI team, one night, reportedly over the 1989 Thanksgiving holiday, when Mrs. Sorelli was on vacation in Florida, planted a listening device in her living room, where Gotti would hold court. It was there that some of the better tapes were made of Gotti, Frank Locascio, and others in often long, drawn-out conversations about crime family activity. With the Gotti investigation being such a high priority, the FBI needed secrecy about the surveillance of Gotti. Even normal courthouse procedures weren't good enough. Usually agents would troop over to the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, directly across the street from FBI offices, and make a presentation to the judge for wiretap or surveillance warrants. But with so many defense attorneys around the courthouse, and with FBI agents like 6-foot 6-inch-tall George Gabriel easily spotted, the plan was to have the judge do things differently, so as not to make any defense attorneys suspicious. To that end, Judge Kevin Duffy, who was the judge handling all of the wiretap and surveillance applications, walked over to FBI offices and went over the paperwork there and signed the warrants. From late 1988 through most of 1989, Duffy kept trooping over to the FBI to read various requests to extend the surveillance authorization, something that had to be done every 30 days. As the agents continued to pick up Gotti's conversations inside the apartment, the tapes would provide the FBI with hundreds of hours of conversations from which to glean evidence for use against Gotti and his administration. But that part of the story was over a year away from developing into the public forum. Chapter 16. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure.